Hello.
Hallo.
Hey, hey.
Hi there.
Dag Luc. Hey Gijs.
Katerina, can you make me co-host, please?
Done.
Thank you. Is it okay like this, Katerina?
Sorry again?
Is this okay like this?
I think so. Is everybody seeing the shared screen of Markov?
Yeah, I see it, yeah.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, hi guys.
How is everyone doing? Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
I'm good.
I'm sneezing
It's
a
a bit
lot, so I'll
cold.
just mute myself.
Just a moment.
During the 1930s, when you indications, before it was that one, the attitude is imminent exactly to what it was.
I do the whole naked thing.
Sorry? I heard someone say something about a naked thing.
Yeah. Should we wait just 2 more minutes to see if some more people join us? I see that some people are still joining.
I'm just gonna test this. Can people hear the sound of the video?
Sure.
Yeah.
A great check.
I'm gonna now.
Interesting, you're pretty good.
I know, because you Mas morre de onda.
What do you think, Katerina? This?
Background?
Or this?
But somebody is making some noise in the background.
Sorry, it's maybe me. I'm trying to get a cup of coffee. I see. Sorry.
Ah, okay. No worries. All right. Okay, are we ready? Should we begin with the introduction?
Up to you. I think you're the organizer, so.
Our usual habit is to start seminars always 10 minutes past the hour to give people time that are a little bit late, and there are always some. I was late myself for a change.
I'm gonna get some coffee then. Be right back.
Mm-hmm.
I might do the same.
For the people who are joining now, we're waiting just a few minutes to see if more people join us before we begin. So some guys around are fetching coffee.
I suppose we can start.
Yeah.
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 All right.
Okay.
Do you start or do I start, Katarina?
I'll just say a few words before you begin.
All right.
Okay. So yeah, welcome everyone. Everyone who I cannot see, I cannot hear. But yeah, just a short intro to the CLEA ArtScience seminars. So as you know, CLEA is running different research trajectories, and one of them is a art science research group. Most of us are present here, and occasionally we invite people to present their research that we find relevant in the conversation about the foundations of art science or the arts and sciences together. And I had a pleasure to meet Marco not so long ago on an event that was organized by the Academy for Performing Arts Leiden here in The Hague. And it was an event about improvised music or music improvisation. And they had several several performances and a Q&A, and Marco had a really interesting question that intrigued me. So after the event was done, we got to talk a little bit, and yeah, we kept talking. So I'll let Marco continue from here, and he can tell us all a bit more about what he's working on.
Thank you, Katarina, for the lovely introduction and the opportunity. This basically will be a belated continuation of my conversation with Katarina. And it will span basically all the topics I deeply care about, which means that it will be a little bit scattered. It will be very diverse. So I expect a lot of people to know a lot about one topic, but not the other, just so I know moderately about most topics here. The main emphasis in this lecture will be basically an exploration of a landscape or a map that has to be explored. But first I want to show you a small clip, if this works.
We need more. That is certain. Why? Because we need more. We need more psychology. We need more understanding of human nature, because the only real danger that exists is man himself. He is the great danger, and we are pitifully unaware of it. We know nothing of man, far too little. His psyche should be studied, because we are the origin of all coming evil.
Now, it might have been a little bit dramatic, but I do think it's an appropriate way to start this talk. Not only because we live in very strange times, and I think we are in a unique and historical point where we're confronted with the reality of this fact. But at the same time, you risk this danger that we think that the current affairs, the current catastrophes, the current problems we face are anything else than our lack of knowledge, our lack of understanding of ourselves, whether it's individually or collectively. Now, Jung was, I think this is more a cry for help than an assertion of fact from authority. Not only because he contradicts himself, this notion of immanence is less a prediction and more of a exclamation of a necessity. I also need to note that he says that we are the origin of all coming evil, but necessarily so, we are also the origin of all coming good. And it's exactly that seeming paradox or contradiction or maybe tension that will be the main theme of this talk. Now, the human paradox is not a single paradox, it's a multitude of paradoxes. And I want to start first a little while back before humans. One of the main topics in this lecture will be brains, or life, or sentience, and organisms. And one of the most pivotal moments was when for the very first time there was an organism who would have some kind of sense of what was outside that organism. And to couple that sense with a kind of action or a change in the environment. One very nice story or example is first unicellular organism that would respond to lights and then move either towards or away from the lights. And of course, the organism that went to the lights by slightly moving its fins or tendrils would have an advantage. And the one who went away, well, they died. And this is basically the key essence of life. It's an embeddedness in the environment and a coupling with the environment. It becomes a loop. Now, many years later, or all of a sudden we're humans. And these humans would be subject to all the uncertainties and terrors of nature. Everything was uncertain. There are risks, dangers, unknowns, incomprehensibility everywhere. Who knows when it would rain? Who knows why it would rain? Or thunder, or animals. But somehow we figured out small steps to keep the uncertainty at bay. Of course, not all uncertainty is as weighty as a tiger or a lion. Right? It doesn't matter if it shines a little bit more brightly one day than the other. It matters what kind of uncertainty it is. Now, they could learn about the world. They could learn how to use tools and keep it at bay. First with physical tools, making fire, creating weapons. But most of all, they created immaterial tools by virtue of not simply understanding nature, but understanding each other. And so the entirety of human evolution from that point on became necessarily contingent upon a different kind of technology, a technology of humans. Religion created order, a means to create a sense of cohesion, means of governance, means of exchange, norms and rules, all for a singular purpose, to empower each other, but most of all also to keep a new kind of uncertainty at bay, the uncertainty of the others, the uncertainty of society, the unpredictability of the dangers and the risks between us. And so throughout history, there's always been a story of good and bad, them and us. But in the biggest picture, it's all us. And the only game is to balance a little bit more towards the edge, leading into the good. And that's our battle, then and today. Now that was a bit of a, let's say, a romanticized maybe, or metaphorical, or maybe even mythical story. But I hope to tell the same story again in different ways via a different set of tools or lenses. Now, first of all, thank you all for coming. This is a very personal project, and much of this is still unresolved and unclear even to me. But I think it's appropriate to give a little bit of a backstory. Now, I haven't always been interested in these things. I was always interested in big picture things. And at some point I realized that the most interesting field in science or academia now is psychology. Physics felt already explored. We were standing on the shoulders of giants. But psychology was not only so imperative, so important, so of weight, yet so unexplored. But after my graduation from cognitive neuroscience, I felt a deep lacking because by then I had already been very strongly influenced by Jung and that passage I showed you earlier, because I realized that psychology, or the psychological sciences in the broadest sense, did not provide the kind of psychological understanding that we actually require. But it is exactly thanks to the modern psychological sciences and theoretical neurosciences, amongst others, that allowed me to gain, I think, a picture on exactly why it's so important and what particular kinds of directions we need to go to fulfill this kind of dream, kind of vision from Jung and many others. Now, today's itinerary will be, in the broadest strokes, first a quick sketch of brains, minds, and what I like to call types of glue. Then, of course, I will explain what noesis and poesis means. I understand they might be very strange notions, but I assure you that, well, I hope that at the end you realize that it's actually a very familiar notion, a meaning that you all know already, but simply might not know it in these terms. Then I want to talk about sense as a fundamental resource, and sense making or sense makers as something that I will call cybernetic foundations. A brief note on the emphasis on sense and sense making is first of all a bit of a counter push against the modern or contemporary notion of what you could call epistemology. Nares is saying that information is the new black gold, the new oil, as if that's the main resource that's so important. But I think it's very clear if you look at the AI or machine learning developments, it's not about information, but it's about sense. And it's also a pushback against the rigid or highly strict academic affairs of epistemology in terms of truth functions, where it implicitly says that knowledge isn't knowledge until it's true in the most strictest sense. But then between not knowing and knowing, there seems to be a gap which we need to make explicit. And in between, there will be what I call poetic intermezzos. The leitmotif, the common thread, will be sense-making in stereo. It will be about seeing the same parts of reality through different lenses, different formulations. One example is shown here, which is let's say, the philosophy of one of my side projects or my alter egos. It says that what I convey is not necessarily to communicate knowledge, but it's to elicit or evoke a process of exploration through metaphor and play. It's for you to find, in the processing of my nonsense, your own unacknowledged sense. This to ignite a deconstructive momentum downwards towards the private meanings hidden in the use of language. And that relates to what I've written above, of which we cannot speak in terms of true facts. We must tell in terms of truthful pictures, which is a slight variation on Wittgenstein's famous quotes. He said, of which we cannot speak, we must remain silent. But I actually very strongly disagree. I think it's a bit of a danger to take that seriously. Although I must note, I'm happy to say that he took that back later on. The general outline will be first, well, I already told you about the human paradox. And then we'll go to the theoretical foundations, because to explore this vast unexplored map, we are going to need some basic tools, some basic lenses and vehicles to explore. The main foundations concern mostly the brain, a brief picture of neurocognition in a modern contemporary sense, and some complementary poetic pictures. Of particular emphasis will be active inference, which will be a bit of a challenge, I think, because it's quite notorious for being very complex and difficult to understand. But I have the hope that we might be able to get a good grip on it via a duality of perspectives. With all that in hand, we'll go to the poetic and the noetic in a way that it hopefully can link to the state of society. And in between, I'll try to explain active inference yet again through a different lens. Theoretical foundations will be, first of all, about the global landscape of cognition. We'll be going to look at the basic organization of the brain. We'll look at the surface and then venture inwards and then ask what is in there. What are the grounds? What is on those grounds? How is it grown into that which we call mind, brain, and thoughts? Then we'll talk about something I'd like to call adversarial synergy or complementarity and mutualism. And then finally, the noetics or the formalism of active inference. Now, one of my favorite papers was this paper called The Global Landscape of Cognition, and it's highly elegant. I'm going to assume no background knowledge, so I'm just going to be very brief about the methods used here. So in neuroscience, we have a technique called fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and it's a way to look at the brain. We get a picture of its organization, of its activity, by looking at the response of its particles based on the way it reacts upon stimulating it with electromagnetic waves. Now, the cool thing about the brain is that it's highly complex, as you all know, but I cannot stress enough how crazy it is that there's only very limited inputs. You see, the brain is secluded. It is interfacing with the world with a very limited set of in and outputs. The inputs, in quotation marks, are the sensory gateways or inputs, right? And to emphasize, most people are familiar with the external or the extrospective sensory organs, like the nose, you smell with, the ear, you hear with, etc. But we also have what they can call introspective sense organs. The vestibular organ allows us to have a sense of balance. There's also something called interoception, which is about the state of your physiology, right? How your stomach is, how your internal organs feel. If there's something wrong there, you will feel it. And there's also proprioception, which is an awareness of your body's position in the world. Right, I'm hearing some sound. Is there something wrong? Okay. And finally, but even though there's a multitude of sensory inputs, there's only one way to leave these mazes of neural pathway, which is via motor output or action. And in between is where the interesting things happen, right? So what they did in this study is they created or pinpointed what they call seeds. The seeds are going to be the surface inputs, the interface inputs, or the gateways, or the doors of perception. And then they look at the network and ask, okay, how deep is it relative to these sensory inputs? And then they get a picture of the organization in terms of depth or distance from the surface. Now, what's really interesting is that they also looked at the neural activation or brain patterns upon hearing or reading certain words. And they asked people how abstract they thought a certain word was or a certain task was. And then they found something interesting, which confirms something very intuitive, that the deeper you go, the more abstract it becomes. And why that is intuitive is because the concreteness is in the concrete perception, right? The basic sensory information, the concreteness of sight, and the abstractness of, let's say, beauty, or love, or disorder. These things are not directly in the world, but we derive it from them. It is an elaboration. And this necessitates or corresponds with what they call multisensory integration, because these sensory pathways also will meet. You can't know the relation between if you don't know the relation between the sounds and the vision, the world becomes very complex. But it's the power of multisense integration, knowing that the sound of the basketball and seeing that it hits the ground actually are one and the same events. And so we see the relations between the patterns or the statistical data or information we obtain from the world. Now, I find this quite fascinating, that there are so few inputs and that everything else happens inside, and yet we seem to be coherent, conscious beings that somehow are able to navigate the world. Because the sensory information you get from those limited areas, along with the genetic information you get from birth, that's all you get. Everything else is you. You elaborate it, you derive it, you expand it, you enrich it. And that's really the interesting and impressive part. Now, the picture here is, again, to complement, this is going to be first of many, is a kind of inside-out cave. The grounds or the soils or that interface, that sensomotoric surface. And inside this deepest cave grow trees of the brain and roots of the mind. And these tangled branches and latticed roots form arboreal mountains and rhizomic valleys. And there where rivers meet at lonely peaks, a temple rests and a strange monk sings. Its melodies percolate, rhythms permeate, and they move mountains and landscapes, and even trees burst out and dance. And as the songs seep into roots and soil, a never-ending story reverberates, broadcast to all who may hear. Now, what story, you ask? Well, inside the deepest cave, etc. Now we're in the cave, and the cave has grounds, roots, and trees through which things, stuff, flows, seep in. The pointer is that the world comes in, right? It's not just a metaphor. One exercise in the seminar will be kind of navigating the feeling, but hey, isn't that kind of a wishy-washy, kind of ungrounded metaphor? But the trick or the exercise here to see that it's both. It can be a playful metaphor, but also conform to truthful knowledge. Now, one important turn in the development of the psychological sciences was the establishment or the maturing of the sense of grounded cognition. Because you see, for a long time, people believed that the mind or knowledge constituted of these abstract symbols. They called them amodal symbols, right? The very same symbols used in your computer, merely a pattern that represents something, and that's it. But that is or was a strange notion. And it was Barcelou who was one of the main people who really established this embodied or grounded turn. The difference was, instead of amodal symbols, he emphasized these are perceptual symbols which don't float in abstraction, but are rooted in their experiential grounding. That is to say, when we experience things, we experience it in terms of our sense or perception. And so why I emphasize the seeping in is because it needs to start at the senses, and then we elaborate it from there. We scaffold from the basic sense and perception. And then the stable patterns, the statistical regularities that cohere become this kind of perceptual symbol, and we memorize them, we retain them, and we also retain the access to them and the ability to reactivate them in organized forms. Now, Barcelou then came up with this notion of frames. You see the small image there is basically the very simple picture of this combination of symbols and frames. So we have these coherent consolidated patterns, which we call symbols of the world in terms of sensory patterns. And then we have frames, which organize them in a particular way to form a complex composite of, let's say, a car or a chair. And why this is so important to emphasize is, how can we imagine? How do people come up with the strangest stories, the strangest mythologies? How did Rowling imagine up whole worlds? How did Tolkien imagine up whole worlds? These are not real in the sense of grounded in reality. They created novel combinations. Not only that, it's not the mere novelty, but they created counterfactual, imaginary realities that retain a sense of systematicity. It's not mere novelty, it's systematic novelty. And those who create systematic novelty with also meaning, evocative sense of significance, those we admire, and we call those artists. And so we accumulate these repertoires of structures and relations and values and instruments. Some people call them representations. Some people don't like that. Some people say models. Some people say, no, it's just a direct enactment. And those are all philosophical discussions I won't bore you too much with. But I hope you can trust me that in this general sense, repertoires of structures, that at least is valid. Now, in complement of a picture of structures, we need to also remind ourselves that these structures are engaging in dynamics, in these processes, continuously changing. And these are dynamics of interaction, not only between the agent and the environment, but also within the agent, between different parts of it, different systems within the agent. Whenever you have let's say, a mental conversation with yourself, whenever you dream up a daydream, these are all dynamics within, of the same kind. So as I noted, there are a lot of debates, fierce, intense. And one of the most controversial notions is talking in terms of information or computation. There will be probably a lot of people that disagree with me, but I want to at least give you some notion of information. And I prefer what they call the ecological notion of information. And it's simply a difference that makes a difference. Deceptively simple, coined by Gregory Bateson. The reason why this is, I think, one of the most elegant ones is because it already emphasizes the relativity of information. You see, a lot of differences are there. A lot of differences in terms of fluctuations in your brain activity. You can use something called TDCS, which creates electrical stimulations on your scalp. None of them creates, complex dreams or sudden hallucinations, because they don't make a difference at that level. And so within the brain or the mind are structures and patterns in terms of which some differences become let's say, a second order difference of significance. And so what we do when we receive the world is receive differences, which in terms of us make a difference. And you can imagine that this goes on, because when it arrives somewhere in the brain, it gets passed on, yet another difference and making another difference, and so forth. And so a picture is that the world is held in these conformancies, where it dances as this fluid emptiness, this harmoniously none, and this mind, it falls endlessly, crashing into itself in flip-flops, staccato beats, caught in dual hurricanes and pearly mirrors. Eyes see a storm as rain drip drops up and fall, clouded, none becomes one. Now, one of the main themes of this talk will be complementarity and mutualism. There are many words. Actually, a lot of topics here will have many words, and I will often use many of them, but it is up to us, and my invitation to you, to consolidate a coherent picture, even though I will use different words, and because I expect that some people will have a certain disposition, a kind of affinity, a prior preference for particular words over others. Now, often there are these seeming oppositions, but in fact they reflect fundamental interdependencies. And there is a danger of conflating them as simply opposites and to be distinguished and separated, rather than acknowledging that the opposition is part of their relation. Other notions used for these complementary relations are polarities or dualities, conjugates, or one of my favorite ones, polar dancing partners. I forgot to add it here, I see, but a very important synonym is from philosophy, where they talk about dialectics. There are many different use cases of this, but it's mostly famous for the use of it by Hegel. Very briefly and simplified explanation is basically there is a thesis and an antithesis, an idea, a picture, and its opposites. And they stand in a kind of oppositional relation. There's a tension. If you would wish to conceive of them at the same time, you might feel that they are incompatible. But when they engage in what they call a dialectical process, there's a kind of potential, a possibility of resolving them, where you transcend the seeming opposition and you get a synthesis. Now, this is used in historical analysis, in philosophy, famously also used extensively by Marx. But I want to generalize this, lift it out from its philosophical home, and do away with many of the luggages that come with it. Importantly, I want to really generalize this and hopefully stimulate seeing this in other domains of your life that you may be familiar with. In machine learning, there is one technique or one architecture that's very popular and is responsible for a lot of cool images. Maybe you've seen the deepfakes, or maybe you've seen these crazy morphing pictures of imaginary worlds. And these are most likely because of these generative adversarial networks called GANs. And basically what they do, they pit two systems against each other. It's almost a little bit evil if the computers could feel. And one basically creates examples or suggestions like, hey, is this good? And then the other says, nah, no, it's the critic. And then this interplay of the kind of the one responsible for generating proposals or examples versus the critic, the discriminator, one can kind of fine tune the middle ground of consensus, what the one wants to generate and what the one permits or accepts. And there are many different versions of this. In neuroscience, my favorite example is what they call, well, I assume you know that neurons are either excitatory or inhibitory. So they facilitate the activation or they kind of discourage activation. But there's something called excitation inhibition balance. That is to say, the brain is extremely complex, highly connected. Right? You've got billions and billions and billions of neurons. In the main cerebrum, you've got like 19 billion neurons or something, and the rest is in the cerebellum for some weird reason. And if the balance is not correct, you get problems. If it's too excitatory, you get epileptic. If it's too inhibitory, there's not enough activity. You want to be in between. You want to be in a kind of critical mode, what they call. And so everywhere in the brain, they need to equilibrate, find that balance between excitation and inhibition. There are also more complex circuits like disinhibitory networks, but they all follow or abide by the same principle. They need to find that balance of excitation and inhibition when sometimes they unexpectedly receive more or stronger signals than expected. They automatically down-tune their own activation simply to ensure they maintain that balance. In a more broader physiological or biological sense, we have something called the autonomous nervous system, which has also a complementarity within, which is between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The one is what they sometimes call the fight and flight, adrenaline activation, active. And the other is more about the rest. You digest, you have the opportunity to digest, you relax, you do your maintenance processes, your immune response. And these need to be in a kind of complementary relation. So opposition with balanced interdependency is complementary. And without this balance, there's a danger of pathologization, of pathology. And mistaking this interdependency for opposition is going to be a blindness to coherence. And as we will see, or I hope to argue, this can come at great costs. And to the right, you see two examples of dualities, polarities, or complementarities. One is the famous yin-yang symbol from Taoism. And I just want to emphasize that, I mean, for me, it took a long time for me to actually think about this, but the profoundness is simply not, oh, they're opposites, or oh, one is in the other. It's about the whole, right? It is that the whole state of being interdependent or intertwined is the actual thing, right? So in itself, the symbol presents this kind of game or challenge. It presents you with a temptation to see it as separate two things with mirroring qualities, but it's actually about the whole being in that relation. The one above is what they call a dual graph. So graphs are mathematical objects with nodes and vertices, dots and lines, connections and things. And when you have a triangle, you have a space within, and they call that a face. Now, if you take any graph, and for any such closed areas, you can say, okay, well, this face, what if I make that into a vertex or in a node? If you do that, you get a dual. Now, this then is a self-dual graph. The red and the blue are the dual of each other. So this is another example of this complementarity. They are each other's complements. Yeah, okay. By the way, if anyone has a question or something is very unclear, then please feel free to let me know. Now we're going to talk about active inference. And first, the noetic, the formal, or the rigorous side of it. It's a bit of a controversial theory in neuroscience, not only for its notoriety, but it's also its grand claims. One of the major papers in 2010 was, the title of which was A Free Energy Principle, a Unified Theory of the Brain. Since we generally agree that we are nowhere near a unified theory of the brain, it was a bit of a provocative claim. And this status or reputation hasn't really changed in the past 10 years, although there's more debate in the public sphere now within these academic circles. But it is very important, although I am very biased because it's basically been my guiding principle or picture even before I started my undergrad in psychology. But I've noticed that the appeal, for me at least, is much more about the conceptual, I dare say poetic picture, rather than the formal rigor. Because the formalism, a dense jungle of maths, has this danger of idealization. It's also no surprise that in the past decade plus, it has actually changed quite a bit. Most of it is adding or refining, but nevertheless, the flexibility of the formalism, both in the mathematics and the conceptual structure, kind of hints that it really is about a certain core, and the rest is kind of open for exploration within the bounds of the formal constraints. It normally is presented in its idealized form. It's a few equations and claiming that the organism needs to follow that. but the beauty is in the imperfection. It's in the way that it deviates what's interesting. And so I will try to lift the implications of the interesting deviations out of that implicitness. The following and what will follow after that will not necessarily be unique to active inference, but it's my personal starting point for a certain avenue of approach. That is to say, you can provide a general account of the conceptual structure, I believe. Because at its core, it's simply a system of highly versatile notions, properly rooted in physics and information theory and other interconnected formalisms. Later on, I will also argue that this poetic appeal is because it has a strong affinity with our innate systematicity. And it's a bit of a mouthful. But basically, if you have a theory that explains how the brain works, and it's true, then if you would understand that theory in an intuitive sense, it would basically latch on to how your brain works. So you become an agent who knows it in terms of mathematics, translates into intuition, and then you can see yourself within better. A bit of a crazy claim, but I hope to elaborate that later. Now, active inference is, I prefer to say, a unifying principle for sentient systems, less so than a unified principle. So the core concepts will be explained bit by bit, and we'll start with the basic reasoning or the conceptual logic, the principles by which it came about. Now, at the right, you see some schematics, first of a cell and then of the brain. And we'll start with the more simple example. Basically, you see that there's a cell and it's embedded in some world, in some environment. And as noted earlier, there's always an interface, right? For anything that's a thing, that's not some amorphous puddle in the world, it needs to have some kind of sense of boundary. And if it's alive, then somehow it's able to remain alive. It needs to have an ability to adapt to the world, which is nothing else than saying, given the way the world is, there's always a notion of a better way for me to be and act, given how the world is. And so there needs to be a coupling between sense and action. Now, maybe a magical being would just immediately couple the sensory states and the action states, but unfortunately, there's no such being. So you want a kind of intermediation, and that's done by the internal states. In other words, you don't want the sensory inputs to immediately also affect the action inputs. You want them to go to the actions with a bit of a detour. Now, these sensations, or the things you really want to know, like, is there a tiger out there? You don't actually have direct access to it. Well, some do believe that, but that aside. So sensations are caused by some hidden states in the world. But by acting, you can influence this world that unfortunately is hidden behind your ignorance. But in the same way that you can elaborate from your sensory grounds or the surface into like small patterns, corners and lines to shapes and forms and meaning and actions and so forth, you can scaffold and build up complex structures, models, representations that are parallel or mirroring the way that the actual world is constructed and consisting of complex compositional entities. And so in this way of scaffolding representations or models of the world, you're effectively kind of extending or pushing out your scope or reach of conception or sensibility. Now, that all is purely in terms of, let's say, representational fit. But that's not the only thing, right? You want to know which influences on you are better or worse, more or less desirable. And you want to know how you can influence the world in better or more efficient ways. And so what you want to do is you want to intertwine perception and action with respect to what you are, your internal states, because those tell you which influences are more or less problematic. Something that makes your heart stop is very problematic. Something that tickles you can be annoying, but isn't that big of a problem. And because we are constituted by interconnected parts that give a kind of pushback when they threaten to go out of bounds of where they want to be, the very impingement, the very perturbation, the very knocking something off its course will create a response. And so the trick is to leverage the information or the knowledge or the sense within your own states to inform how your action perception should change or generate changes. Is that clear? Because it's very important that this part is clear. I see nothing. No? Okay. Yeah. So this whole sense of seclusion or boundaries is formalized in terms of Markov blankets. Now, Markov blankets, funny word, but these Markov blankets are from formalism from do calculus, or a kind of formalism about statistical relations over networks of influence. That is to say, influences always flow in certain ways, right? The lights follows a path. The ball that hit your head followed a path. Everything follows a path, and everything needs to go through something to get somewhere else. And so if you take a very simplified graphical depiction of a cell, you can say, okay, so there's like some important states that receive input from the world. So let's say that this one circle noted by 1 is like a source of influences. And then it enters you, influences you via these 2 nodes called 2 and 3. And they pass on that influence to the node depicted with red and the number 5. But 2 and 3 also pass on information to 4 and 6. And 5 also pass information to 6 and 7. And now something very important is happening here. You see, if you want to know the state of 5, you don't need to know the state of 1. 2 and 3 is sufficient. So if you know the states of 2 and 3 and how it influences 5, 1 is redundant, right? It doesn't add any extra information. So the way this is depicted is something about conditional dependency. So 5 is condition dependent on 2 and 3, and 6 is condition dependent on 5 and 3, and so forth. But there's a conditional independency with 1. Now, this is the very simple example, but the claim, I think is an intuitive one, is that for anything that possesses such a blanket that organizes or intermediates influences from the world, you can have such a relation or a state of conditional independency. And this latches on to exactly what we talked about before, right? You want to know about the world, but you don't have direct access to it. Yet you can have a very clear and lucid and sophisticated understanding simply because of that conditional independence. Whatever 1 is, its information, the way it influences you, will arrive at 2 and 3. And hopefully you can elaborate it to figure out what may be even behind 1. Now, on the right, you see the exact same thing, but with explicit notation of the formalism we're going to talk about. So the sensory states, symbolized by S, just to make sure. So the mathematical notation that looks a bit like a weird E it means it's part of the set. So S, the small s, is part of the big S, the big set of all S's you could have. Right? That's all it is. For actions, the same thing. The possible actions, all the possible actions, big A, and one of the actions is going to be small a. So at the boundary, at the interface, you have sensory states and action states. Importantly, these are unidirectional. So everything that comes in is via sensory states. Everything that goes out is via action states. And if you follow the arrow from the S, you see it goes to the internal states, which in turn goes to the action states, which in turn changes the world, the hidden states of the worlds, which in turn, again, change your sensory states. And that's that crucial loop that we really care about, what I talked about in the very beginning, that story of that small unicellular organism that figured out or happened to arrive at this coupling between sensory states and action states, of going to the light with the little actions it had available, such that it was better for its internal states. Now, it gets really interesting when there's not just one Markov blankets, but for example, blankets of blankets, right? And then they cooperate to model the world, because that intermediation, that detour to the internal states, needs to be a model if it's going to do its job of figuring out how to act, how to sense or perceive in relation to the world for the sake of surviving and its fitness, as it were. But an addition from blankets of blankets, like in plants, you can also have blankets within blankets, within blankets, within blankets of blankets, and so forth. And that's something called complexity. And it's highly segregated in the sense that there's different blankets, all secluded, all semi-autonomous, but it's also very integrated in the sense that they need to cooperate. Their behavior aligns with each other. They conform each other. They don't get in the way all the time. And then the parallel, this is very important, the parallel with blankets of blankets as structures and organizations is that it has a kind of parallel with the way it behaves in terms of inference, because it needs to model the world. So a single blanket models the world as such, in its own, but blankets of blankets model the world together. They can play different roles and cooperate. But blankets within blankets also need to model their environment within this whole set of blankets, right? Like I talked about earlier, you can have parts within you that talk with each other. So when you have this complexity, it's inevitable that some degree of complexity, we can speak of modeling ourselves, modeling the world. You can call that reflexivity or self-reference. And this might be the basis of why we can speak of ourselves, think of ourselves, have a notion of who we are and what we do. And it's not just a mere possibility, it's also that it's extremely powerful. Because as things get more complex, there's more ways to fail. There's more ways things can go wrong. There's more ways that things start to get stuck in a suboptimal mode. And so it's a useful method to be able to mod yourself, so you can also do that whole loopy thing of sense, action, perception with your environment within yourself, because that's what creates coherence. Now, the active inference formulation is actually based on something called the free energy principle. And for those who are familiar with physics, might be like confused. Because in physics, we also have a notion of free energy, which is distinct from this. It's a bit of unfortunate naming. Free energy in physics comes from thermodynamics, the free energy available for useful work, the energy that is not trapped within the entropy. If you have a box of gas that is at rest, that you've left alone for a long time, you can't extract anything. But if you have a very volatile or hot gas, or maybe a better example, a ball that's on a hill, it has free energy that you can exploit. Now that's physics. This is about an information theoretic free energy. Specifically, it's variational free energy. And it's based on a class of statistics or domain of statistics called Bayesian inference. So effectively, and I'm using a bit of a different terminology than you would find in Wikipedia or textbooks. I'm going to talk about senses and observations. So as we knew, we have senses available. Sorry. Oh. What did I? Oh, sorry. I made something strange. Sorry. Let's say that S is like a situation or hypothesis, and O is an observation. So what you want to do is, given your observations, you want to know how the world is. And so what you do is you how do I say? Sorry, I'm just kind of, why did I do this? Anyways, let me say it like this. Bayesian inference is basically conditional inference. Based on what you know and what you don't know, you update what you don't know. So you have a prior belief, your expectation, and then you get information that might or might not diverge from your expectations. Based on how much it diverges, based on the difference, based on the surprise, you update your expectations. Ideally, what you want is what they call maximizing model evidence. You want to make sure that your models are optimally accurate, such that you're not surprised when you don't want to be surprised. What you want is that you're able to engage with the world in such a manner that you update your models such that you're conforming your expectations to how the world actually is. Now, this is the basic roots of formalism. There's a lot of maths involved, but that's the principal image that I want to share with you. But there's a lot of other related formalisms and ideas and concepts and notions. A whole tree here in the original paper for those who are more interested in the formal side. But I want to emphasize some other notions. I'm going to come back later. That of self-organization, the fact that systems can self-organize without seeming explicit or intentional mechanisms, for example, ant colonies, or the flocks of birds, who somehow remain coherent. And there's something also called autopoiesis, and the root of it means basically the self-creating, the self-making, the self-perpetuating, which is kind of a capturing the essence of life. What you want is to have an organism or a system that makes and remakes itself, and that's autopoiesis. Then you have cybernetics and the good regulator theorem. And cybernetics was a huge thing many decades ago, and kind of fell out of fashion, but it was very interesting, especially the good regulator theorem, and which is basically as follows. It says, any good regulator of a system needs to possess or be a model of the system and the world. One of the most popular examples was a thermostat, which once is to have a notion of the world, such that you can have a notion of how to act upon the world, to remain in a certain boundary, in a certain state. Right? Without a notion of how the world is or how you are, you can have no means of regulating yourself to be in a certain preferred set of states. Then there's also something called non-equilibrium thermodynamics. Now, equilibrium is basically the resting state. For any physical system, for any physical sets, there's always a tendency towards a ground state. Right? It wants to be in a preferred energy state. If you leave your coffee mug for very long, the temperature will become equal to its environment. If you go about in your daily life without cleaning your room, it will get messier, etc. The reason why that's important is because a lot of implicit intuition in physics is based on equilibria. Right? We ask, how does it end up? But we're going to talk about brains and humans and societies, which are not in equilibrium. They're constantly changing because they're open systems. Energy is constantly added. People keep generating activity. People keep influencing each other. It's just a set of bouncing balls all the way. It never gets to rest. And that's the complicated part. And then there's also dynamical systems theory, which is kind of related, which is basically, I think these are very related, but it's very important to note that we can have dynamical and non-dynamical systems. Your computer isn't very dynamical. Humans are very dynamical. If you would have a means of systematizing a collection of heat baths or chambers of gases, and you would add heat and make them connect in such a way that energy flows through them in unpredictable ways, you get a dynamical system. But the trick is to have dynamics which are unpredictable, but systematic, regular or steady, or reliable in some ways, like us. Now, the proper mathematics are going to be important for what's going to follow. So bear with me. I hope I can explain properly. And if you don't fully understand it, don't worry too much about it. Now, as mentioned before, the basic roots of active inference and the formalism is in Bayesian inference. And as noted, what you want is, you want to maximize model evidence. Please excuse the error there. You want to maximize model evidence, and you want to minimize surprise. I'm really sorry.
One of your most interesting notes that could be possibly negative.
Sorry? Sorry? No? Okay. So you want to maximize model evidence, and you want to minimize surprise. Right? Surprise is simply the deviation, the unexpectedness, right? Because you can't afford certain unexpected events. But the thing is, if you want to do this with a lot of states, with a lot of information, with a complex world that's constantly changing like ours, that's going to be very hard. It's something called computationally intractable, basically a mathematical definition of what's basically impossible. So this computational or mathematical procedure of gaining theoretical or true models of the world is certainly going to be impossible for us if you would do exact Bayesian inference. But why then do we still claim that we do something like Bayesian inference with our brains? It's because we do approximate Bayesian inference. So what we do, and this is going to be very important, we basically have these so-called generative models. Right? We already talked about us having internal states or representations, and let's call them models. And as noted, we're dynamical systems, so they're not static. So they're constantly changing, they're creating activity. And so these generative models generate activity, they generate influences, data, information, changes, hopefully in a productive or useful way. But these generative models are going to be implicit. We can't, and we shouldn't directly map the definition of these generative models to the physical states of our brain or our body. That's going to be something else. But what's important is that these generative models, as formally defined, capture the statistical regularities in the world. We capture the conditional dependencies. We capture the rules, the systematicities, the way that all that statistical flux, that statistical patterns are ordered and related to each other. That's what the generative model is about. And so these generative models, they basically have associated prior beliefs, right? Kind of prior expectations about certain things in the world. And we call these densities, probabilistic densities. Because if you ever see a probabilistic depiction, you often see like this curve, right? But this curve is like one-dimensional, two-dimensional, not one-dimensional. But you can also have higher dimensional curves, and they're going to be then densities. And so these densities have like a center or a mean, which kind of depict or represent the biases, kind of your expectations, and the precision, the narrowness of your density is basically how certain you are. So if you never played football and someone asks you to kick the ball and shoot in the goal, you might be very uncertain about where it's going to go, right? So you have a very wide or imprecise distribution of where you expect the ball to fly after you kick it. But if you're I don't know, Ronaldo or Messi or some amazing football player, then they'll be very precise in their expectations, right? And that's a very important notion. It's all about precision, where the inverse of its variability or its deviation. Now, these generative models, as I said, are implicit. What corresponds to the actual physical states is what we call recognition densities. And these recognition densities are effectively a kind of a proxy for that thing that makes Bayesian inference intractable. And we call this Q. They are the densities that are to replace the use of P, the true posterior, as it were. So we have an approximated posterior belief, which is the belief that we would have if we update our prior beliefs given the data. So the image then is you're an organism, you have a lot of physical states, and they encode, or they effectively encode, a ability or a familiarity or an affinity to recognize some kind of pattern, a thing, or reality about the world. And that makes things very cool, because that means then if you have this recognition density, you can couple something else on it, make like an action or a procedure or a policy with the activation of other beliefs conditional upon a particular recognition. And so you can imagine having these blankets of blankets of blankets, all doing this active inference thing, having recognition densities and associated actions or policies that then have these chains of activation, hoping that they are systematic or ordered or useful or productive chains of activation. Now, this all is to say, in terms of Bayesian inference, we continuously update our ongoing priors or expectations about the world and turn them into posteriors, right? It's just about updating your beliefs, that's it. Now, the formalism in detail, the most important thing is the decomposition I show you, but I'll still try to take you through this. Now, we're going to talk about two equations. The first is free energy or variational free energy. The S and the M, or mu, are about the sensory states and the internal states, right? So the free energy here is going to be a function of these two things. By the side note, you can have many different formulations of this, and this is just one particular one. And this free energy is going to be here defined as being equal to the complexity minus the accuracy. The complexity is going to be a KL divergence, and is simply a measure of divergence. What you see there within the brackets, you see this cube psi conditional upon mu, which is basically that recognition density of the external hidden states given my internal states. And that's going to be a probabilistic distribution or density. And then this KL divergence is going to find the divergence of that relative to the probabilistic distribution of external worlds given my generative model, my priors. That's all it does. So it's going to basically that part of the equation is going to ask how much work you need to do to change one prior to a posterior, right? How difficult is it to make that, to bridge that gap between your expectations and the actual state of the world, your priors and your posteriors. And then you subtract from that the accuracy. And the either is about energy function. And effectively what it's doing is it's looking at the surprise of the sensory states given your models of the world, the generative models, and the beliefs about the external world. Now, I'm not sure if I said, but the goal is to minimize free energy. And the reason why is because formally, by definition, by mathematical definition, the free energy is like an upper bound. It's a ceiling, how big your surprise one gets. And so you're always, if you're minimizing free energy, you're minimizing your surprise about the world. And some surprise is more relevant than others, but that's a little side note. Now, that's free energy. You can also have expected free energy, where we add what they call a temporal thickness, right? Because it's not just about the now. You want to imagine about the future. You want to be able to anticipate and predict, have a notion of the consequences. You want to see through time, metaphorically speaking. And here, you again have this energy function. And again, you're going to look at these surprisals. And I'm just going to be brief here. You want to have this notion of epistemic value, a notion of ambiguity about how the world is. You want to have a notion of how valuable, how good, how accurate are my models about the world, such that I have no ambiguity about how the world is. Then you also have pragmatic value, which is about the preferred outcomes of how the world should be. Now, if you have a lot of uncertainty about how the world will be given your actions, it means there's a kind of risk, a kind of threat. You become anxious or insecure. You want to have a certain confidence in your ability to make sense of the world as it is, and a confidence in your ability to act upon the world such that it will change, conform your preferred outcomes. Now, to recap, all this formalism isn't that important. It's mostly for people who do care. What I want to emphasize is that this common currency of expected free energy, this thing that any living system with a Markov blanket should minimize, that can be decomposed in multiple ways. One of those ways is decomposing them in an epistemic value concerning sense or accuracy, and pragmatic value concerning risk or threats, which is in terms of the extrinsic or the external consequences. So here again, you see the same things, right? We're going to emphasize the epistemic and the pragmatic, the intrinsic and the extrinsic. Now, the epistemic or the intrinsic is, as I said, minimizing the divergence between your priors and your posteriors. And that particular mode, that emphasis, can be related to a set of notions to give a certain intuition, right? So when we engage in the world, we sometimes need to explore before we exploit. If you come to a strange party and you know no one, you're not going to immediately try to you want to explore what's going on. You want to have a sense of what's going on. You want to have a sense of who is who, right? Who's the boss here, who to stay away from, before you engage in exploitation, which shouldn't take too literally, but it's more in a reward or outcome, a goal-oriented behavior, where the epistemic is more of an information-seeking behavior. Another relation is that the epistemic is about the value of information, the novelty, the learning. It relates to curiosity. So again, if you're unsure about the situation, you want to know what's going on in this party, you're going to be curious. It's going to reflect in your behavior. In a more general sense, there's a notion of epistemic foraging. Right? Just as animals can forage for food, you can forage for information, which I want to generalize as resources for an epistemic grip. Resources that afford you or allow you to have a clear grasp on the world. Another way to improve this epistemic aspect is to simplify our existing models by reducing excess complexity without cost at its accuracy, because there's a cost to complexity. We hypothesize that dreaming is one mechanism to do this, but as I said earlier with the basketball example, the mere integration, the mere knowledge that these two signals of the bouncing sounds and the ball hitting the ground, that these two are related, part of the same event, that's integration and a reduction of that complexity. In turn, you can generalize that. If you would do that for a lot of different things, put things together when they fit together, you create coherence, which again is a reduction of that excess complexity. You become more efficient. Now, the pragmatic is simply going to be the mirror of this, right? You don't care that much about how the world works. You just want to get what you want to have. You exploit rather than explore. Right? Right after that party, you're not going to figure out who everyone is. You're just going to ask someone where the best drinks are. It's about getting the reward, the extrinsic value of resources, and having that security. You want to have pragmatic foraging. You want to have resources for pragmatic affordances. What gives you more ability or power or control, right? You would have more confidence about the way that your actions lead to preferred outcomes. And so that is all about this kind of increasing of the precision of future outcomes by adapting our action or action policies to minimize risk. Importantly, even though I emphasize the decomposition, they are complementary and contextualize each other. As I noted, it's seeming opposition that are part of a bigger whole, right? The opposition is part of the interdependency and relation. Importantly, there's actually a very recent paper that had some interesting results about how adaptivity improves with our balance. It's about constantly trading off these two given how the context currently is that makes us efficient agents in the world. In a more general sense, this has actually been a very long-standing problem known under the guise of exploration, exploitation, dilemmas. And interestingly, this has always been seen as something multidisciplinary. It's not unique to the brain. It's not unique to one discipline. It's multidisciplinary for any adaptive process. It goes back to as far as 1934 about, I think, organizational decision-making. And it emphasized simply, very elegantly, the relation between the exploration of new possibilities and the exploitation of old certainties, which is really nice, right? You want to explore new possibilities, the unknown, when you're in epistemic or curious mode, but sometimes you need to exploit the old certainties, right? The habits, the reliable, what you can kind of lean on, right? But the question is always, what is the optimal balance? Because it changes over the context, it changes over the norms, which you value, which you prefer at every given point. That's quite complex. And in active inference, we find a very formal definition of this, which can guide our intuitions and kind of open up the richness of concepts that are driving our sense-making around this. Importantly, they have always characteristic failure modes, right? So when you're have this extreme and unresolvable precision or imprecision, in the case of excessive precision that you can't somehow loosen up, you get these entrenched old certainties. You get entrenched habits. You might be addicted to heroin, and you rationally know it's bad for you. You know it damages you. Somehow you want to stop. But the process of doing the habit has become too rigid, too precise, because there's not enough uncertainty, not enough freedom to allow for a change or disruption of that loop. The opposite is having this excess imprecision. It's too uncertain, and you're unable to overcome the uncertainty. You get stuck there in this uncertainty. You're unable to constrain the space of possibilities, right? Maybe some of you might have experienced sometimes like this, being overwhelmed by the whole huge range of possibilities, and you have no way of navigating that, no way of choosing things, right? It's an overload of choices and paths to take. And that's a kind of poetic pathology, where the former is a noetic pathology. Now, in 2017 in Friston, where partly helped also, we linked this appropriate balancing of the epistemic and pragmatic with a notion of what they call in philosophy or logical inference, abductive and deductive inference. Now, most people know about deductive, right? The kind of stereotypical Sherlock Holmes, even though we didn't really do deductive logic, but mathematics generally is deductive logic. If you have some kind of set of axioms, and then you are fully certain that some other theorem or a thing would be true, right? You know 1 + 1 is 2, and you know 2 + 2 is 4. So you know 2 + 2 + 1 + 1 is going to be 6, and that's deduction. Induction generally is like an extension, right? An extrapolation of some kind of pattern, but that's boring. The cool thing is abductive inference, because generally we need to make a bit of a leap of faith. We need to explore these possibilities, these unknowns in a skillful way. We can't just brute force it. In machine learning or computation techniques, sometimes there's a brute force method, right? It just brutally just goes through every single possible state, takes every single door. But that would make things very difficult. Luckily, we somehow are able to navigate these uncertainties and unknowns quite well. When there's like a gap in our knowledge, we tend to get quite creative, make really interesting guesses to infer upon. And the reason why I'm saying this is because there is this problem of, okay, then we have modes of inference, and we can evaluate hypotheses, we can test them, but where do these hypotheses come from? You want to generate hypotheses, candidates, ideas, models to test and explore, but you can't do every one of them. You can't make every single possible hypothesis either. So you want to be smart about that. So here we have a nice complementarity again. Remember the GANs, for example, is kind of similar to this. It means the implication here is that we are both that which generates or creates problems or questions or challenges or pictures, and we are that which resolves them, which answers the questions, resolves the problems, meets the challenge, explores the unknown spaces. And so we are that kind of paradox, bound together. And we linked this balancing of the abductive and deductive, this kind of engaging with the unknown, the random but smart guesses, and the other side, the logical verification or the logical step-by-step certainties. That balancing we linked with insights, the sense of, aha, eureka, this sudden collapse of uncertainty into certainty. Right? One moment you're like so confused, and then all of a sudden it comes to you almost fully formed, this sense of explanation or understanding. And that's a key transition phase where there's a sudden collapse of uncertainty about how the world works, and you can confidently move on to exploitation. Now, interestingly, it's not just active inference. There's also been other interesting studies. Very recently, Simon Dedeo, a researcher at the Santa Fe Institute, independently arrived at the same picture from a very different angle. He also noted this sudden transition with the condition of balancing these two modes of the abductive and deductive. And very nicely, he did this in the context of mathematical proofs. And part of his title was Explosive Proofs in Mathematics. That's quite elegant. And basically what he said is, the picture is, you can have deductive steps, right? Where each step is certain. Each step you have full belief in that they're correct. But if the thing gets really complex, that might be not the perfect, not the ideal way to do it. Sometimes you can kind of let go of that condition of each step being fully certainly deducted, and you trust, or you allow yourself to trust, in a kind of intuition where kind of strange associations, kind of maybe unclear, fuzzy intuitions about beliefs influence the way you come to believe in the mathematical problem being true or not in a certain way. So there's this interaction between the deductive process and the abductive process. Importantly, he also showed that there's a fine-tuned balance required to get to that insight. And that you can't always simply add more abduction for benefit or just maximize deduction. There is a trade-off, exactly the same as in active inference. And even more recently, like a few days ago, some research from Sussex had a nice result where they combined theory and simulation modeling of multiple agents, so agent-based modeling. And they created 3 agents. One who just acted in accordance to goals, so goal-directed behaviors. Another one who really just cared about the epistemic signals, having truthful pictures. And one that was conform active inference, where these were necessarily balanced, right? The kind of way of balancing that active inference prescribes. It needs to be context dependent. And there's intrinsic motivation, or intrinsic demands of balancing these. And they showed, conform the intuition's predictions, that if you only care about one of the 2, you get stuck in a problem. These unipolar models were prone to either bad bootstraps or suboptimal convergence. Right? One gets very inefficient ways of sampling the world, and the other gets how do I say this? Like an inaccurate picture of the world, while the one that was prescribed by active inference avoided both. I do have to say I'm not entirely sure because I literally just discovered this paper today. But yeah, so there's from multiple angles interesting amount of evidence and more too, but there's limited time. I'm already worried about time now. Now, one can see it basically as these blanketed systems or blanketed spaces swimming in conformant seas of perturbative flux and inferential flows, seas of all the causal chaos of influential confluences, intensive expressions, and evocative impressions. And as that empty nothingness, where systematicity wrests itself out of the seeming stochasticity, it's born by this tautological, self-referential, self-embracing love. And the sea may flow through these porous systems, partly trivial significance, merely rhythm waves, habituated patterns, just music to dance upon. But soon the steady beats are co-opted by virtue of their recognition. They're co-opted into its never-ending enactment of its own unfolding, co-opted to play parts in its stubborn persistence to justify itself to the context. It says, here I am, I exist, and I'm here to stay. Hear me if you have ears, speak if you have voice, for I will affirm your presence if you affirm mine. So let us participate in a mutual evocation, and in so doing invoke our existence as one whole in a joint marriage against the relentless onslaught of perturbative chaos and dissipative noise. Now, I hope some of that made sense, because we're now continuing on to poesis and noesis. I was inspired by the ideas by Vico Giambattista, an Italian philosopher around 3 centuries ago. And he had this notion of poetic logic and poetic wisdom, opposite to the noetic. I was inspired, or I discovered this via someone else, a very strange place, Hayden White, a meta-historian, who used his ideas to talk about the tropics of discourse and consciousness in humans and society and throughout history. Fascinating. Still can't wrap my head around it, but it made an impression. The closest notions that are similar to this are the Dionysian and Apollonian, popularized by, I think, Nietzsche. And rather than giving a stark definition, I'll just try to prime you and hope that you will extract some meaning out of it. So first is the Dionysian, the poetic, and it's about the intuitive innovation, the pleasantly surprising. It's related to the abductive inference, to insight and epistemic exploration. It's concerned with possibilities, curiosity and wisdom, and openness. It's associated with the continuously moving, the improvisational adaptation. It concerns flexibility, a kind of expansive reach and a rich contextuality. Mirroring that, you have the noetic, the Apollonian, the rational order, the reassuring consistency. It's associated with deductive inference, analysis, pragmatic exploitation, certainty, will, power, closure. Certainty at each step, ordered preservation. It possesses or associated with a power by virtue of a focal precision and rigorous identities. But of course, it's about integrating them, making sure they mutually contextualize. Now, the reason why I'm talking about the poetics of active inference is, well, for a whole host of reasons, but not in the least because I believe we need something like a poetics of active inference, something like a theory that is both very formal, but also to be integrated with our intuitions and our poetic modes. One way to maybe facilitate this, not saying that this is the way, this is an exploration, one way to facilitate this is to kind of turn it into an intuitive language of intuitive notions, which I hope to justify later. But it's about space and flow, density and structure, mutualistic relations, and systematic organization. And this is all conform the key components of active inference, that formalism I showed you earlier. Spaces are simply that which is secluded, where all the dynamics and processes happen in the interactions between the internal states, in this constant coping with the world, in relating to the world. All the flows are the exchanges, right? They're not simply packets, it's constantly flowing. It's about these densities and structure. It's about the mutualistic relations because they're all conditionally related. You can have a synergetic mutualistic relation such that in both directions between two systems or entities, the relation is seen as beneficial. That's a mutualistic synergy. You can have a systematic organization. It's not merely organized, but in an ordered way. It has rules, it has protocols, it has complex compositional representations or algorithms, and so forth. Now, crucially, active inference is a process theory, which is quite unique. Most theories are either descriptive in terms of properties, or in the language of computation, or some kind of arbitrary schematic of properties or systems. It is a process theory for complex, adaptive systems consisting of interdependent, correlated dynamics by virtue of the fact that they have mutual information between each other. Right? One structure helps explain the other. One structure is statistically correlated with the other. And so if one thing gets distorted by noise, it can be fixed or corrected, but all the other structures or systems or processes that stand in a mutualistic relation that are conditionally interdependent. Because if there's one thing that's distorted, the 5, 6, 7, I don't know how many other things that are conditionally related possess enough information to make up for that error. And that's a pretty powerful thing that underlies self-organization and robustness. Also, to emphasize the process theory means that variation is the norm. In our implicit culture or folk psychology, we normally think in terms of static properties or intrinsic properties, even worse. We don't think in terms of dynamics and processes. We expect that to each word or each object or each notion is a static picture of properties. And that's very dangerous when it comes to dynamical systems, especially if these dynamical systems are powerful, influential organisms that can do a lot of crazy stuff. I also really like to emphasize the etymology of certain words, inference especially. So inference is composed of in, at, on, into, and fero, to bear, carry, for some reason also suffer. But I prefer this to carry into. Into what? Into spaces, secluded spaces. How? By flows that evoke something in these spaces. Right? They're evocative. And they do so over structured paths. And these paths are traces from inferences past. Right? If you, a related notion is stigmergy. And if ants follow a certain path again and again and again, then that path becomes suddenly salient because they leave pheromones. They're traces of a path taken. And the same happens with the brain, right? Some people might know about the Hebbian principle of fire together, wire together. It means if they fire together in a certain time window, then they're more likely to fire again. They will wire together. And this simple principle organizes the system. But such reinforcements of regular or repeated patterns might also lead to regulated or persistent paths. Right? Again, this complementarity, the paths and the states or structures. Importantly, the whole kind of inference in active inference is conditional inference. There's not just one inference for a system, it's always conditional upon the context, right? The particular processes of inference depend on the particular context. It needs to be sensitive to the things that matter, the differences that make a difference. Now you can do that in a formalism, right? You can simply say, well, one evaluation of the states given some model, some X, is not the same as the same inference of the same states for another, given another model, conditional upon another context. But I don't think that really conveys much intuition. We can ask, okay, if inferences are physical flows, if inferences are physically instantiated, if there really are exchanges between spaces or systems, then it must travel. And the way it travels must, by definition, of the fact that we live in an actual world that is a physical system, must be amenable to being described as a flow through some space or some manifold, right? Any physical trajectory takes the path of least action. Now you can't break the laws of physics. So what you can do is change what would be the path of least action. You can change the so-called topology. You can change the weights of the networks. The whole web of possible paths can be changed or controlled or regulated such that there's a higher likelihood, a higher confidence that that flow will take a particular path, hopefully conform your preferred outcomes. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt.
No, of course.
But
yeah.
Huh?
Sorry, yeah?
Yeah, but we're reaching the almost 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you like to wrap up and we wake up the rest of the participants for.
Yes, I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
I will rush through this. All right. Now, basically, the craziest claim in this whole seminar is as following. I conjecture that not only is such a project of poetifying something like active inference valuable, there's a particular reason why it's also, I think, possible and valuable, again, argued from something like active inference. And it's, the importance of this is for, yeah, I need to explain this. So the importance is this. Psychology, cognitive theories, a lot of these generally are very sparse, very impoverished in the kinds of pictures they have of what is contained or constituting our mind. I mean, I like Barsloop, but simply symbols and frames really doesn't cut it. If you actually think about the things we care about in the world, about the things that matter, about the way we describe things, it's too sparse a language. We need a richer language. Right? What are themes? What are motives? What is meaning? What are rules? What are modes? What are systems of thought? What is a question in terms of the physics of the brain or any formalism out there? Now, the reason why I think active inference or something like active inference, a process theory of this sort, would be invaluable is because I think it's amenable to what I call vertical integration. The thing is, no matter what it is that comes into your mind, through your body, through words, etc., it needs to find a place. It needs to be in terms, translatable to in terms of what you already know or are. Now, there's different systematicities depending on where you look, right? The physical organization of the visual system is different than the auditory system and the sensory system and so forth. They have different affinities. Now, language, notoriously, is pretty bad at giving words to experiences of meaning, of subjectivity. I mean, why else do we have art? And so there is a question of affinity between that which we are to convey or express and the means of expression. Now, in the very beginning, Jung said, we need to understand ourselves. We need to understand our psyche. Yet, we still don't have a language that it can both describe the psyche in a way that conforms with science. And so it is imperative that we find a language or a means of cohering or integrating the pictures of our subjectivities, our psyches, our intersubjective relations, that which we call meaning, as well as in the same language, the world as scientifically or truthfully known. But it's only a process theory that would hold over the scales of the brain, over the levels in which it may travel, that can do this. It is to consider the possibility that there is a possible third person or scientifically described picture regarding neurocognitive dynamics, which would map onto the very dynamics that we encounter or through which we understand ourselves. When we feel something, when we have a sense of meaning, an intuition, that must come from somewhere, unless you believe in ghosts or spirits. And so that is an encounter with some activity. There's an inference of some activity, and that activity must be rooted in the brain. And so if you have an understanding of the brain's activity that you can translate at that level, to that level, then I sincerely believe it would act as an enormously important catalyst for self-understanding and in turn, intersubjective understanding. It becomes an opening up of the spaces of possibility and a conjunction with the means of verifying and organizing the space of possibility. Okay, I'll skip that. So you are all sense makers. It's a mathematical, theoretical, and empirical reality. And this fact may not be described in full by science in the details in which you are, but that you are one is a fact that cannot be denied by virtue that you gain information, by virtue that you cultivate models, by virtue of the fact that you learn to engage with the world. You get more sophisticated and truthful pictures. And so for any matter you can engage with your mind, consciously, aware, whatever, you can engage with in different modes. I cannot tell you how, I can only tell you that you can. You can do it in different angles, in different ways, and the game is for you to figure out in your own terms, in your own intuitive and rational capacities to navigate these, to cultivate, systematize your repertoires of thought and intuition in virtue of good behavior. And this is not simply frivolity. It's not simply fun or interesting. It's unequivocally a moral imperative because each and every individual society contributes to the collective processes of sense-making, for as a collective and as a society, we also engage in all this autopoetic, active inference, self-organization, and sense-making. And who else than us is going to do this? You must stop believing in some kind of enlightened individual, stop believing in the myth of certainty that will magically come out of science or AI or whatever choice of myth you want. We need an entire culture, more acknowledging, ideally revolving around sense-making, because I assure you, power and resources we have enough of. We just don't know how to use it. Bohm said it best. If we can have a coherent approach to reality, then reality will respond coherently to us, simply by virtue of if our internal models of how our actions will lead to consequences is coherent with our sense of how the world works, then of course the reality will respond coherently to us, because it cannot be incoherent. The incoherence is from us. And so when we are not coherent, we will produce results we do not intend. And some of them will be undesirable, simply by virtue of the imprecision of our predictions of how our actions will lead to outcomes. And so the question is then, how do we know whether there's incoherence? And the answer is simply, you must be sensitive to it, because we can't rely on mere definitions of a static nature. We need to embody a sensitivity to it. And so he links a generation of unintended and undesirable consequences to incoherent engagement with the world. And he notes the requisite of sensitivity to coherence to be able to ascertain the presence of coherence. And now the important, sorry for that it takes so long, but this is very important. Is anything I want to leave you with is this. Now, we've always been defined by the non-biological evolution. The technology of our institutions, of our culture, of our organizations, everything that is on top of us, but parts of this ecosystem, these are all technologies, more valuable than the physical technologies. And so this is all an ecosystem. And there's very rigorous work about how ecosystems work in terms of mutualistic connectivity, in terms of K-cores or decompositions or whatever. There are very clear signs, very clear models about what causes collapse and entropy. And we must not fall yet again into the trap of thinking that we are exceptions to lawful rules. We are not at the center of the universe. We are not beyond nature. And our ecosystems, not just the natural one of biology and climate, it is the ecosystem of human systems and the surrounding and in-between ecologies. These will either collapse, but more likely, they will survive as an ecosystem at any cost, including that which makes it a livable, worthwhile ecosystem, a human ecosystem. And so the basic idea is this: for all activity, there are consequences. Some are intended, some are not. Some are desirable and some are undesirable. And we don't need to know every consequence in detail. We need to know what is the proportion. How much of the intended and unintended becomes canceled out? Which of them dissipate? Which of them synergize? Which of them will come bite us back in the ass centuries after the fact, such as industrial revolution and climate change? Now, we cannot expect that we can always just let it happen, find out afterwards, and try to not fix it, apparently. We need to know what the costs are of delayed realization. We need to know what the consequences are of this incoherence. We need to develop the sensitivity individually and collectively, understanding what complementarities are to be kept in balance and what are the consequences if not. Because we are also an ecosystem with the ability to generate unintended consequences which we might not be able to understand. And one day, it's statistically certain that these entropic perturbations might be intractable to overcome. And when that happens, and we don't realize this in time, it might simply be unfixable. We need to be predictive, anticipatory, understand the consequences of our actions, and understand what we are. All right, thank you for your enormous patience. This is all I dare to say for now. I hope some of you will be able to stay for some session of participatory sense-making. And again, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to all your comments and discussion points and questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any thoughts?
Well, I have a comment.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm currently reading a book from Sapolsky called Behave. And there is a parallel between some things he explains there and some of the things you say. Apparently, these noetic and poetic ways of thinking would be grounded in separate parts of the prefrontal cortex. The noetic part would be in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the poetic part in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. That's at least what I understood from the fusion of just what you said and what I read in his book. And when people when we switch off, for instance, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and so only the noetic remains, people tend to make very utilitarian decisions, and they even have a lot of difficulties to make any decisions at all. And the other way is, it's also the other way around. Apparently, you really need to have both systems to arrive at to make good decisions. And I think it goes in the same direction as what you told us today, that both the poetic and the noetic needs to interact to arrive at practical decisions, good decisions.
Can I ask you something? So upon reading that and making this association, what do you take from this? Is this a sense of mere understanding? Does it give you a hope and an opportunity to change for the better, or does it create a sense of defeatism? Because what is the added value of that picture, if I may ask?
Okay, the added value of picturing which part of the brain is doing what?
For example?
Yeah. No, it's just a realization. I don't know how to answer to your question, actually. I'm not even sure I understand it. What I can say is that the model of the world that you presented is pretty much the model of the world that I already had. And I find it extremely important to have a good model of the world to take good decisions. But you cannot calculate everything because it takes an infinite amount of time and energy. And so at some point you have to take decisions with an incomplete model, with a model that arrived at an incomplete picture, let's say, of the situation. And that's where your intuition would come. And indeed, you need to find the right balance between both. And I find it, actually, my feeling is that it gives me a useful picture, I find. Because on one hand, you know that it's good to have a good model of the world, and that you need to work on that during some part of your life, at least, or some part of your time. But if you want to have 100% certainty before to take a decision, you will never take any decision. So you need to cultivate, you need on one hand to make good models, and on the other hand, you need to learn when enough information is enough in order to take action.
Absolutely. I just need to, the poetic and noetic is not chosen, if it would just be exploration and exploitation, I wouldn't have chosen these words. If it would just be abduction and deduction, I wouldn't have chosen those words. So importantly, yes, there's always need to be a balance, but both sides can be cultivated. One question is, what is the bottleneck? Right? You can't, it's not about merely balancing. It's about cultivating those which stand in this complementary relation, right? So where in society do we cultivate the poetic? I'm not saying cultivating an act of exploration. I'm not saying everyone should be an artist. It's an actual mode of cultivating your faculties of sense making. And how do you cultivate intuition? It's a very difficult question, but I can be very confident that a culture of ready-made answers, a culture of choosing your sides, a culture of remembering rather than understanding material in school is definitely something that is conducive to an imbalance of the poetic and noetic. Because it's not about exploration, exploitation, it is about the intuitive that one possesses. I didn't have room to add it because as you saw, it got very long, but this is not simply arbitrary. So one nice example is the world's probably the best mathematician at the moment is Terence Tao, I think, Terence Tao. And he explicitly noted that what he calls his 3 levels of mathematics, which perfectly encapsulates this. He says, first, we learn with intuition, right? Fuzzy pictures of mathematics. Then we learn the actual proper rigor, the formalism, the proper method of doing it. But then you need to revisit your intuitions. It needs to take part in the process. There's a lot of implications, a lot of implicit assumptions that it's about overcoming your intuitions, overcoming your irrationality, overcoming all these things we associate with the poetic, that when we are doing science, that we're not doing anything with the poetic side. That is a mistake. And so it's about also creating a culture that acknowledges this as a very complex and important faculty. We need to figure out how it works, how it's amenable to cultivation and training, and what the consequences are of not doing so. It's not merely exploration.
Isn't it then, I mean, it's not to say that there is a right way or a wrong way, but isn't then, if we're saying the overpowering noetic, then isn't it in a sense wrong to try to open up the spaces for both sense making from the point of science? Because what we're doing here is we're introducing scientific theories which will allow for poetic to finally get some space. No? You see what I mean?
I mean, finally get some space. What do you mean? Are you implying that science cannot be facilitating that role?
No, I'm saying that in order to facilitate it, science first needed to step up and say, hey, how about we formalize our intuition so that we can take it into consideration, right?
So that's, yeah, I mean, that's exactly why I did this weird talk. I mean, active inference is, in a way, already describing these modes in a way, and it's formal, it's kind of sterile. It's not connected to the expressions of the poetic, right? I mean, the controlled laboratory studies don't tell you about the roots of a lot of human activities in the poetic. We need to know what the actual value is.
But isn't it also an impossibility to study the poetic?
Yeah, so I think for a long time it was. But now, the research by Deo and the people from Sussex, basically the whole Fristonian community, and some other things I haven't shown about abductive inference. These are all previously unexplored and very, very poorly receive little attention. And this basically means we kind of sandwich it, right? So we have a bottom-up theory in terms of processes of inference, and in terms of the physical constitution thereof. And we can, from the other side, kind of make a system, an abductive or explorative picture of what are the activities that require poetic skill, right? Imaginative capacity, right? Not just in artists, but also scientists, or people who are good at, I think entrepreneurs are a really good example. Improvisationally skilled people are also a good example. My personal interest is people who possess both, people like Bohm. I think those are the most interesting. There's also some research about insights, about using creative or insight-based approaches to problem solving and versus analytical problem solving by someone called Kunios. He's working on that and already shows some nice, how do you say this? Nice lateralizations and different patterns of brain activity. So there's different direction to kind of pincer, to kind of approach this whole concept, but we're just nowhere close to really grasping it, and we need to start somewhere. For the first part.
I would like to add to this idea that science cannot capture the poetic. Well, I think the two approaches are really complementary, and what science can do is kind of force you to go in places where you're not inclined to go. The problem with intuition is that intuition kind of chooses always the easy way. The intuition has a tendency to say, yeah, I know how it works. Yeah, that's intuitive. I like that. And the things you don't like, or the things that are difficult, or the things that are abstract, intuition tends to kind of go around them. While science has the advantage of being systematic and going step by step, following a certain method up to the points where you don't really want to go. That's why mathematics is so hard. Most people don't like mathematics because it's hard. You have to concentrate. You have to forget things that would be easier to do. So in that sense, building this kind of a formal theory of intuition, while a formal theory can never capture everything, that's by definition for me, you cannot formalize everything. It forces you to look at certain things and maybe discover things that just following your intuition you wouldn't have discovered. And that's why I think that this approach of Friston, the active inference, I think it's a very big step forward in understanding these kind of processes. I don't think they are there yet. My own criticism is also that I think the mathematical formalism is too complicated to start with. I'm sure that the brain cannot be captured that precisely in these things. But I think the general philosophy behind it, as you say, which is a process, which is a theory of fluidity, of things that are constantly adapting the one to the other, that I think is a very great step forward in understanding this process of sense making. And that is a process that I'm also analyzing on my own at the moment, using theories that are related to the one of Friston, but that are, I would say, a little bit more flexible.
Thank you. I mean, I feel the need to push back a little bit because, I mean, this is clearly not topics that are easy, but I've been forced by my intuition that I had to, for example. Additionally, a difficulty is not to be equated with one of the two modes, especially because, so one is about focusing precision, right? Maintaining certainty at each step. One is being able to navigate uncertainty. So we can associate a capacity, right? What is your capacity to have precision in presence of complex procedures, for example? And the other is then how much uncertainty can you cope with whilst maintaining an efficacy in navigating the uncertainty, navigating the space of possibility in a way that's meaningful and useful. So that's why I noted the emphasis on vertical integration, because effectively what you're doing is you're kind of trusting the way that the theory, the way that systematicity is implemented in the non-accessible terms of explicit verb, explicit language. I mean, there are enough accounts and enough evidence of seemingly impossible sophistication of the creative or the subconscious processes. I mean, the thing with Kahneman is he already was very clear about that, System 1, System 2. There's been very clear evidence about, let's say, the computational efficacy or power of that which is non-conscious or non-deductive. And that must be acknowledged as an actual systematic process. What is difficult is asking how is that cultivated? We are intellectually lazy when we say it's talent, when it's gifted, when it's given by whatever deity. We must acknowledge it's a real physical process with apparently a systematicity able to solve very complex things. Probably because the brain simply is systematic by nature, by virtue of that EI balance I talked about in the beginning. So I strongly, to be honest, respectfully also, you know, I don't think it should be equated with laziness. I mean, scientists have also been very lazy in following the deductively laid out roads. Secondly, the complexity thing about the mass of the formalism, one must acknowledge that the complexity also comes from the world, right? If you create a generic or skill-free systematicity or approach to how that complexity that comes in needs to be allocated or canalized or interacting with each other such that it resolved its own complexity, well, then I don't think it should be a complaint that the math is complex. It's the world that's complex. I mean, all the mathematical formalisms are symbolically complicated, but it's all the comparison of flows and densities, differences and divergences, things to minimize and things to balance. I personally, yeah, that's my personal opinion.
If I can say something, I very much like the
who's talking?
Marta.
Okay.
Where you like what you say in relationship to what Katarina mentioned and Francis mentioned. Like in my mind, when I hear you, I hear the insistence on like being like doing the I would say like even mostly linguistic work in this excluded middle in the between the like introduced by this division between the scientific and the otherwise. So once there is this distinction, you know, like talking about integration is like it's usually like a combination of talks from two sides instead of finding the language which doesn't really, you know, perpetuate the distinction in the first place or arise, like is established by the distinction, right? Mm-hmm. So when you say like, okay, so science will come and validate us, right? So something like Katarina said, or like, no, we'll push you to be like, it's like you're either take like one lens on another lens and see on each other. Whereas what you are doing, and I really like, and you know, like it's like listening to like, to linguistic or poetic exercise and finding the language which will map continuity between like positions without the like already without this like within this excluded middle and precisely there. So another work that was just recently published by Di Paolo and team with linguistics body and
yes.
Right?
Linguistic bodies.
Yes.
Yes, very nice.
It's a precisely the same spot, right? It's a different topic a bit, but it's
it's the same topic. You're absolutely right to mention that. I was you know, you see it got way too long, but I wanted to mention that. Hanne de Jager is in Belgium. So it's called Linguistic Bodies by Di Paolo, De Jager, and someone else. Mm-hmm. And De Jager is actually one of the main reasons I got into participatory sense making. I also wanted to, I mean, it's already been a bit out there, but I also want to talk about loving as letting be and knowing as letting in. I mean, I've talked a lot about letting in, but the reason why I had that poem with the self-embracing love is it allows itself to be. That's what a blanket is. It creates the space for it to be and become. So that was the implicit metaphor in that poem. But you're absolutely right. That's a bit of an emerging thing I'm really excited about.
So, you know, like I see it mostly as a, like primarily as an exercise in language, what you're doing, you know, like finding the wording, you know, and then it's interesting how this field, like the spot being like in this stage, you know, like what kind of conversations and what kind of like what you call the participatory sense making about the work, like you know, it's again like searching like what we are doing, because I understand that like the major contribution is that this language is adopted and present in all this, you know, like moments of conceptual modeling and then mathematics and this and this and this, because then this language shapes sensitivity for different types of questions and so on and so on. So that's something.
Thank you very much. I really like that. It's no, absolutely. It like I said, that's why I use a lot of different words, because then you're kind of weakening the strength of a single word by not attaching only one to them. It's also my philosophy, as I said in the beginning, it's a deconstructive momentum, right? The hidden meanings. I like
yeah, there is a thing called purple poetry as well, which is the poetry of continuous enumeration and exuberation of words to depict things. You would totally be into that. But I really like your input, Marta, especially because it now brings back the conversation that I had with an artist friend of mine back in Belgrade, where we couldn't figure out what art was, especially today. And of all the potential frames that we could put on what art is, we opted for it to be language. So that in fact, effectively what each artist is doing is they are developing their own language. So when we speak about language, we don't need to think about words, right? We don't need to use human language. We can use any other media.
So there's a very nice link I want to make because you're one of my only Serbian friends. For those who don't, so I'm born in Serbia for really weird reasons, and I this is second friend I've made who's Serbian. So as you know, I have a love for the word inference, the flowing into it, carrying into a space, which matches fits with a lot of other etymologies. But Serbian, for inference, the root is in key, and the notion of logos, the equivalent, I think, if I'm correct, is actually the door. So the words that we use to kind of denote or indicate or point to a space that's enclosed, these spaces are entered or given access to by particular keys, by particular inference, particular ways of getting in.
Right.
And so what the artist does is the inverse. We're not receiving the world. You are creating a way of evoking activity in others. Your responsibility is to invade or penetrate or seep into other people's being and find those spaces that are yearning for evocation, the patterns that they don't even know they want to have activated. Oh, I could feel like this, I forgot. What is this special feeling? What is this particular sensation? It's a particular configuration of spaces and systems engaging in a mutual influence. They are like, what's going on? And you like it. And that's what the artist does. It provokes.
May I say something, guys? Hello. My name is Gela. I'm very, with great interest hearing your presentation of your topic and this conversation. And of course, art and artists, they use language, but not literally what we understand it when we do science or something else on the even everyday conversation. It is an art because artists try to explore or even invent their own language to say something, to express something. This is very important, maybe, what they do, because when we go to the gallery or even just visit artists to see their work, they gave us a great influence to talk with us in a different way, to broke our brain, to broke our everyday tools that we use, you know, like a cage, because to show us that we are human beings that able to talk in different languages, in color, in shape, in, I don't know, in feeling of space, to learn something and discover something. This is very important when you go to the museum and suddenly you understand that artists talk with you and discover something that you never expected. Absolutely. Because everybody can say, oh, I can draw. Oh, I love red color or blue color. I can write something or drawing something. But what is important when we say that it is masterpiece of the art, when we suddenly discover something in very easy way. This is a very significant moment and magic of the art. I think this is very interesting to see, because what Francis said and mentioned that science is absolutely like math. Math leads you even somewhere you don't want to go. Artists do the same, but in different ways. And maybe it will be interesting to see this at first point great leap between of this area. But it's very interesting. What interests personally of me in this topic that you offer, I really want, and very curious, how are you trying to connect this absolutely not connectable in at first moment area? And thank you very much for this effort and effort that I'm trying to do it with you, and I'm looking forward to hear something interesting next.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. It's yeah, I'm glad it resonates. So your question was, how am I trying to connect these super separated things? Yeah, so yeah, I wanted to put it in a thing, but you know, it got long. So there's two notions important here. One is from Stuart Kauffman. I think it was an evolutionary biologist. Anyways, he had a beautiful notion called the adjacent possible. So for any state of reality, let's say we have a system and has states, and there's always a context of the adjacent possible states it can go to. It's only one step away from that other state. Now, we can say this for any level of granularity or time scale, but we can always say for anything that's real, there's an adjacent possibility. Now, for any system that remembers, that can learn, it's about expanding the space of possibility such that you get what I call a contextual expansion. You see, all these spaces kind of are connected in limited ways. There can always be an abstract or implicit meta space, phase space, state space, whatever, such that we can have an implicit notion of distance. It's probably intractable to get a precise definition or measure of distance. There'll always be a distance. One clear argument for this is the brain is approximately, not perfectly, but approximately organized in a small word network. That means there's a very low amount of steps you need to make to get to any other point in the brain, potentially. So it's all about finding paths between that are close enough, but valid. See, that's why metaphors are existent. Why do we have metaphors if words are supposed to be systematic and perfect? Right? Wittgenstein was like, I'm going to have the perfect language and the perfect syntax so that everything is precise. If that would be possible, why do we use metaphors all the time? See, metaphors is carrying over. It's in a way that kind of implies there's not actually a path. You're kind of transferring. You have to carry it over a river that you cannot cross normally. It's almost a little bit of cheating. But that is still a way of transferring such that they increase their mutual relation. And so you're kind of making things closer together, because for things to have a mutual relation, a valid association of, oh yeah, this and that step makes sense, that brings things closer together. That's the topology. Because a whole lot of connections make a topology. Yes, sorry, Katarina, I'm rambling this, but yeah, Katarina.
Ryan.
Marco, thanks for your talk. Really, that's
yeah.
Great, interesting points. Just picking up on your last thing you said, I was curious. You mentioned cheating, right? In relation to that all thought couldn't happen logically. That we needed metaphors. We needed a kind of cheating. Mm-hmm. So my question was, how are you cheating?
I mean,
how are you cheating in this talk?
Statement. So the thing with cheating is, so earlier I said we have this kind of error correction mechanism, right? We don't actually see the whole world as coherently as we think it is. We fill it in. That's not unique to the visual system. That's how the brain works. You can have such impoverished signals and packets of information and still draw so much sense out of it. A mere gesture, a pointing, a weird way of smiling can convey so much meaning. So
could I ask you the question another way? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Because you talk about like you need this kind of noetic and this poetic side. Mm-hmm. But and I'm not saying this is completely true, but I feel like in a lot of the talk and even your answer now, it's more explained in terms of the noetic.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of.
So how do you integrate this poetic into your into your thinking? Because at the moment, like 90%, I really like the poems, by the way, that you presented. And I thought that, you know, I even thought you could do the whole talk in poems. Like what would happen if it was only the poems? But 90% of your talk was in this kind of noetic mode. And so I'm curious, where is more of the poetic in your thinking?
Hidden behind my
and because at the moment it's also like a kind of how to say, it's more like it's kind of like the noetic trying to invade the poetic or something.
Ooh, that's
it's like the noetic trying to explain it and therefore to kind of go through it. No, Francis disagrees with me. Okay.
I'm always very afraid of scientists trying to invade their terrain. Ooh.
No, I'm not. No, it's not a question. It's just like, but in terms of a lot of your talk is about finding this balance between these two positions. I'm not afraid of either side, and they're in balance, you know. So even if one does temporarily invade the other or take the other one over, by definition, there's going to be some kind of balance, right?
Yes.
That was more of a response to Francis, but the black can never win. You know, we're always afraid the black can win, but the black can never win. There's always two sides of a wave, the crest and the trough. The crest can never overcome the trough. So, so I just want more of this balance. I mean, I'm just curious, where is this balance in there? How are you cheating? How are you lying?
But that's a totally different thing. I mean, let's ignore the cheating, but I'll just answer the rest of your question. So first of all, I am years long deep in existential crises. I do not pretend I have been integrated or I'm whole or enlightened in any way. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. I've noticed how important and how difficult it is. I mean, I've been this science nerd for most of my life. And then after my master's, I got a bit in an existential crisis. I kind of delayed and pushed it away by doing a startup in AI and technology, and then doing some philosophy, thinking that would be sufficient. And no, I went to many seminars and conferences, and damn, they're also trapped in their own mazes. It's just really hard, in part because our entire society seems to scream it. I mean, I have to actively work against my adopt or internalized biases, you know. Like now, like I said, whereas the rest of the poet is hiding behind insecurity, I'm trying to make a case for the balance, but I still feel like science has more authority, even though I know and that the resonance in the affective feeling way can actually be more influential. But I don't have the ability to trust this yet because A, this is the first time I've talked about it in public, and B, I don't consider myself an artist. I have no idea how to go about this. I mean, I was whining to Katerina. I have no idea how to integrate this in this form. I am still in conflict, but that's the whole thing. I think the first step is allowing yourself to be in conflict. So maybe in the future I'll be more integrative. But for now, it's irregular poems squished into the noetic stories.
I think you very nicely put the problem that we are trying to solve in our art science group, that is find some kind of a synthesis of the artistic approach or what you call the poetic, and the scientific, what you call the noetic. And a synthesis means that both are equal partners, that it's not that the one is invading the other or the other is teaching lessons to the one. I mean, there's always this bit of defensiveness, I feel. There is no need for defensiveness.
No. It's not defensiveness. It's not defensiveness at all. If by definition, if his talk is right, and I think there's a lot of good points in it. What he's saying is that his thinking already intrinsically has this poetic side within it. That science is already intrinsically poetic. So there's no question of a battle between the poetic and the scientific, or the noetic and the poetic. That's not the terrain at all. That's exactly the old argument, right? That's exactly the old world that we're moving away from, in which this argument exists between the poetic and the noetic, between the artistic and the scientific. We're already going one step further and saying they are already together. There's no need to put them together. They already are together. The question is, like, how do we, my question is like, where is the lying? Where is the poetry? Like in what you've already done, right? In your thinking, it's already using metaphor. It's already making these poetic corrections. So rather than trying to think that there's still like a connection to be made between these two sides, we could instead try and see the way in which the thinking is already doing this jumping, is already doing this leaping across rivers. So that's my question in a way. It's like, in what way are you already cheating in what you're saying?
Yeah, I think I need to make it
not in a bad way, in a good way.
Yeah, and I need to make clarification. They are in conflict. Look, they're intertwined insofar they're both embody both capacities, but they are conflicting. I am trying to understand one affair in two different ways, and they lead me to different implications. That's a conflict. See, the mode generates or direct me or push me or draw me to a particular picture. I don't know who this is.
I just muted you, Gela, because the noise was coming from you.
Okay. So they are in conflicts, but that's why I called it a human paradox. So one problem with synthesis is I hate these sorry, I don't want to say that.
Sorry, I thought it was gone.
So there's a difference between creating an abstract picture where they're already integrated, where someone creates an abstract system and give it a place there, 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 and there. That is not synthesis.
I think you're both correct and both wrong. I think there are different levels, right? On the level of internal, yeah?
Oh no, I was my glasses.
I want to ask Orion. Orion, am I right? This is correct.
Yeah, that's right.
Orion, you just, hi. Listen, you said that science, art, and whatever, they already together. I'm really interested if you have examples.
Okay, I'll just continue with what I was speaking because it follows with this.
Sorry.
So it's also something that Marco said, and that's that you begin with mathematics by having these fuzzy ideas of what this could be or how can it be formalized, and then over time you learn the formalisms, you learn the language of mathematics, then you go into more of a noetic thinking, and you reach a kind of a limit. You kind of come to a paradox into you become too precise in your thinking, and you need to break it further to open new spaces of what that potentiality is, and therefore you again return to the intuition, right? This is why all great thinkers, or David Bohm mentioned, they're equally creative in all of the fields. Their thinking is open, right? But what I wanted to say is that I think that it's a matter of different levels that, they are already embedded in us, in our processes, being conscious or subconscious. Both are processes, right? And the processes are feeding each other all the time. But on the level of society, on the level of mechanisms of how we deal with that kind of thinking, that's where the limit and the apparent opposition appears. Because in your academic circles, you can't come to the conference and recite a poem, but it's not that you don't think in poems. It's not that you didn't dream a poem, or or that you had a equation solution while writing a poem, but it's not accepted, right? And
I think you're really, really hitting the nail on the head, and this is really the core issue. So I mentioned briefly about the need to balance factors or influences. The thing is, humans intrinsically, individual human agents intrinsically are subject to an imperative of synthesis. But it's not about cognitive dissonance in the old school sense, but merely incoherence has a cost. And so there's always an intrinsic disposition towards integration or synthesis, or this radical rupture such that you don't have to subject yourself to that imperative, because we're able to do that. But in society, there's no intrinsic imperative unless people enact that imperative. There's no intrinsic enclosed space, which is to synthesize the seemingly oppositional in society. There's only people who enact that, just like only people enact autopoietic systems.
Perhaps also what I'm wondering, one of the slides that you had in your presentation had these relations associated with the poetic and noetic. So like before you went into the poetic is more contextual and the noetic is more, what was the term? And in this slide, you also had, like you said, that noetic relates to will and power, and the poetic relates to, what was it? Wisdom and intuition, I forgot. So
this,
and the one maybe before.
Yeah. Yep.
This one, yeah. So perhaps how I would ask this question about how to nurture a language of both processes simultaneously is, how do we give power to poetic?
Mm-hmm.
Because we already observed that the analytic thinking has the power in this society, but the poetic thinking kind of lacks it.
Yeah, that's a big dilemma, and I'm struggling. So only way I could see so far is what I tried at the end is to see the consequences of the imbalance or lacking of its value, because there's this kind of acknowledgement that it might not be fair in a way. It might simply be such that its real value and power simply doesn't really become salient in society, and I'm really concerned. I just don't know. I just only know that, well, I'm very confident that a lot of issues are reflecting this imbalance, but the society at large isn't sensitive to that kind of incoherence, I believe, unless the people individually do. That needs to change. The culture,
I think, I think, yeah.
But I'm open for suggestions. But I agree. If you could find a way, that'll be amazing.
I mean, I guess, yeah, oh, just a sec. I think it might actually be a really bad question. Like, look what happened with the Second World War. You gave power to an artist. I'm kidding.
A bad artist.
Yeah,
a rejected artist.
A bad artist. Yeah, Ryan.
But I think this is also there's a sort of cybernetic explanation to this as well, right? Like a feedback explanation, which is like the kind of the diagram. It's the sort of the simple diagram you gave of the cell or whatever with the input and the output to the world. But it's like if you kind of continually output like a kind of like a noetic explanation, then you're going to kind of get back this kind of noetic explanations. You're going to kind of get back these noetic answers, right? You're going to continually reinforce that feedback loop. So if you make this like poetic things, then that's also, you're going to enhance that aspect of your thinking also. Which is why the poems were also great.
But you have to make a decision. You have to make exceptions, right? You need to start somewhere. So
I just need to emphasize, it's not a property or a substance, as in it's a mode of engaging, of emphasizing. It's not as if you send out a property and it gets reflected back. But I do agree that that kind of loop is present in society because it's the cultural language of noetics. And
that's what I mean. It is a language thing, though, right? I mean, to a certain extent.
Well, it's
not completely, but there is a noetic language. There are more noetic languages and more poetic languages, or languages have more of an emphasis in that way. So, and the world responds to you the way that you talk. The world talks back to you the way that you talk to it, let's say.
Well, if I talk to Krishnamurti or some kind of enlightened monk or some kind of, hippie, and I talk to them about science, they're going to talk to me in terms of the poetics. See, the fact that we're dominantly noetic as a society means that the likelihood of what you receive back from any utterance is going to be reflecting the probabilistic distribution of people's affinities or dispositions, right? You go to Burning Man. You talk about science, they're going to talk to you in poetic terms, because that reflects the distribution of the population, right? That reflects their associations with system of language.
Yeah,
right?
I think we've sorry, we're speaking in slightly different domains. I was reflecting back onto your comment earlier that in your own self, in your own work, you didn't know how to integrate these two things. And I was speaking more about this in the sense of your feedback loop, your personal feedback loop with the world. And you're thinking of it, you're responding in terms of like a generalized thing, that there are people that's more noetic, or people that use more noetic ways of speaking. So there's just a mismatch there in our context.
I mean, like I said, I was a science nerd. So if it would be really in itself feedback loopy, why would I have been, throwing away my academic career or unable to commit myself to science because I didn't believe in the noetic foundations, because I was pulled to this intuition that there's something missing that I have now come to call the poetic. The feedback loop is, I think, more in the momentum of how it emerges. Because see, when I started with this, I had this alter ego, and it accelerated because I started caring about it. I gave it a name, I gave it a place, I gave it eyes, and then I started to see incoherence through those eyes, and that became autocatalytic, that became self-reinforcing. But as that grew stronger, it starts to conflict with the noetic. At some point, it resolves that conflict and it becomes synergetic. And I think that's the feedback loop. The feedback loop is in the complementary development. But in the beginning, there's this big startup cost because it's just not there yet. You need to create your notion of poetic. So I agree that there are feedback loops going on, but I don't think it's as simple as you're now poetic and you will be poetic again, as in get poetic back again. But it's an important question, the role of the cybernetics and the feedback loops and so forth.
I think that the opposition between the poetic and the noetic is too typical of our society. We are tendency to always oppose these two, because there has been this kind of extreme view of science in the Newtonian analytical view as deterministic, determining everything. And that, of course, then people feel that they have to rebel against it, and then they tend to go to the opposite side and to go to the purely poetic. Well, most of what we do in our brain, in our daily world, in language, it's in between. Sometimes it's more metaphorical, sometimes it's more rational, but it's never really rational, it's never really purely metaphorical. It's always in between. And my career as a scientist, I think, is atypical in the sense that when I came out of high school, I saw myself rather as an artist or a poet. But I wanted to know what science was, to kind of, I wouldn't say destroy it, but to reform it from the inside out. My idea was this traditional view of science, that's not correct. But if I want to reform it, I need to understand it well. So I studied physics, which was kind of the hardest thing you can study in the hardest of the hard sciences. And within physics, you come down to the limits. You see quantum mechanics, relativity theory, all these things. You find those limits. But physics itself is still too rigid. So that's why afterwards I started to look at psychology, cybernetic systems theory, where this fluidity becomes much more clear. But I always had this idea of what I'm learning now, it's a particular language, it's not real. Whatever was in physics, I never considered as that is reality. It's a tool to understand reality, and that tool is good for certain things and it's not good for other things. And the language of the artist will be better to express certain things, and the language of the mathematician will be better to express other things. These are languages, these are models, these are tools to understand. And that gives you the flexibility that you can switch from the one language to the other, use a bit more of this language, use a bit more metaphorical language depending on it. I think that the opposition is when people tend to make absolutes, to say like, this is the truth, that mathematical model is the way the world is. And then the poets feel kind of excluded and they start attacking the whole of science. Well, for me, science is a set of tools, a language that is good for certain things, not so good for other things, and that language is expanding, and things like this model of Friston is a way to expand it to understand more of the things that are traditionally viewed as poetic. I don't think that Friston's model is the end of it, but it's a step in the right direction. And like that, we're constantly building models, developing languages that capture certain aspects of reality, but nothing will ever capture the whole. It's this flexibility that I'm arguing for. If you don't have this absolute view of science as being the truth, then the whole thing is not such a big deal anymore. It's just set of tools and a language, and the people who are stupid enough to think that because their tool works well on one thing, it must work on all things, well, yeah, those people have to learn the new worldview, and there are still lots of them, unfortunately, but they will learn it eventually.
Okay.
Sorry, guys, we're coming closer to 3 hours of conversation, and I assume that we burned a lot of brain cells. So I propose to see if Marco, you would still like to do like a short exercise in stereo sense making in the last 10-15 minutes, and we finalize like that.
You want me
Does
to
it work?
just riff off of something?
No, but I thought you had an exercise for the.
Oh, the whole thing was an exercise.
Okay. You know, I thought there was like a game to play.
I mean, okay. Well, I can try one thing. So basically, implicitly, if I had more time, it was basically about what I called trying to find your unacknowledged sense in my nonsense. I mean, I call these neuro-poetries, but I don't really treat them as poems. I don't really care about metrum, because the constraint is, for me, it's very important that they're rooted in what I think are truthful pictures. But I try to combine it with something what I think is evocative, trying to find the language that evokes people's intuitions at the places that I think will, well, reduce the divergence between their priors about how the brain or similar dynamics work, by giving them intuitive facilitation. And I was wondering, what do people read in this? So I'm very grateful that people said they liked it. Does anyone have, and can someone tell me which one they liked in particular or found interesting?
Well, I think the fact that you emphasize sense making and the different aspects of it, I think that is indeed kind of the core. That's something we should understand better, whether in a noetic or in a poetic way.
Fair enough. So one other exercise, not that we can do it, but basically we can do a meta exercise. So I actually don't know how to really train this, because I said, you know, you're the one who has to figure that out. But one thing I found interesting is the notion of dualizing. So I said earlier, anything you can conceive of many different ways, but how do you find a different way, right? There's an infinity of different ways. However, there's a very limited ways that are opposite. So that's the beauty of it, right? If you have an infinity of opposite spaces, so infinity of alternatives, then the easiest operation that you can do is opposition, symmetry, contrast. So, you know, imagine one would be highly noetic, and you ask them, what are the characteristic things that you think makes noetic thinking powerful? You know, oh, you love logic and facts. You know, you think you're super rational. What makes you so powerful? And then they say, oh, you know, it's about the certainty. You know, it gives me the sense of power. And then you ask them, what is the opposite? You know, what do you think of possibility? How do you navigate that? And probably they'll resist. But there's always a situation in their life where they have to engage with possibilities and embrace that. And so it reminds me of a technique a psychiatrist friend told me, but it's kind of this, you force them in a position of that they wouldn't agree with in a rational sense, but by connecting with an experience where it demonstrated that, you're forced them to agree. And I'll explain it as well. Yeah, let me just ask you guys, what do you think are good exercises to explore your natural opposites?
I thought of one thing that I read. Yeah, please.
Hello, yeah. I fancy the exercise that you can call a voice dialogue, where you can search for all the different voices inside of your system, and you can put them in a dialogical way to talk to each other.
Ooh.
So opposite sub-personas, you can say, are going to engage in a dialogue, and you can put them in different chairs and you have a talk. So you can embody those different parts in you, and you can externalize them by putting them in different chairs even. So you can really create a dialogical setting. That's a nice exercise.
I really like this. Voice dialogue?
Voice dialogue, yes.
So how, is there a way of going about evoking different voices?
No, it's not really evoking, it's more about exploring different voices. There is no evocational energy in it. It's just curiosity and helping people to explore their total range of voices they carry around all day. All those different intentionalities and intuitions and knowledge. Yes.
It reminds me, I really like that, because I always had this thing with role-playing. I have a friend who's very shy and very shy to get expressive or angry. And so I just adopt the role that I feel like is her opposite, kind of externalize what I want her to internalize. And she actually then gets angry and just says what she wants to say finally with his anger. But then the question is, can you do that for yourself? And but I like that. Thank you. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
It reminds me of family therapy, family systems.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Maybe
a bit. It's a bit connected, but the family system, it's more intrusive, I think.
Yeah, but I think it might be necessary. You might.
Yeah.
The danger is how creating this voice that you kind of are fake using, as in you're using it to confirm your noetic disposition. You're creating a fake strawman to fight. There's the danger. I don't know, but maybe it's as simple as you just have to be truthful or committed.
Yeah, it doesn't have to do anything with a judgment. It's just an exploration.
Yeah.
It's non-judgmental. It's more phenomenological.
There's
what
a
is
lot of
there?
Artworks that are dealing with this, with voice, with releasing the voice or the sound, you know. I also thought about one thing. I think a quote, I think maybe Nele, you wrote it somewhere. I think I got it from you, but it was a quote from Jan Schwankmajer, a Czech filmmaker, who says that if you have an idea to do something, but you're not quite sure how to do it, don't go for the method that you would want to do it, go to another thing. So if he wanted to do a movie, he would go do a drawing instead.
Okay.
So to not use the predictable methods to do something, but to go and explore it in a different way. So yeah, if you want to make a movie, go sing a song.
That's interesting, because there's always that which is expressed and the means of expression, right? So if that which you want to express is rich or sophisticated or mature enough
it will find its
to make
way.
a movie. Sorry?
Yeah, it will find its way.
Yeah, even if you take something else. That's it's interesting. Yeah. So see, this is all related to a notion of machine learning is quite well known, the transfer learning. You want to transfer something beyond its normal habitat, as it were. And that's really the key of intelligence development. Like kids, I want to talk about kids too, but kids are useless. They're stupid, they're useless. Jesus Christ. I mean, why would evolution allow that? You know, like a deer can walk in a minute. A baby is useless and annoying and noisy and attracts all these dangerous wild animals for like the first 5, 6, 7, nowadays 16 years of their life. So what's up with that? What's the benefit of that, right? They engage in the opening up of the spaces, right? The thing is, there is a realistic possibility that you kind of have to lock in at some point. And so you want to stretch out the space of possibilities, the opening up, the connections before you lock in. You know, you want to give yourself room as you grow and accumulate knowledge. It might be something like that. Maybe that's, someone asked, what is that, the two different ways that poetic and noetic tell us where to go, right? They're kind of two different cartographers, two different ways of having a compass or a map. One way you can see it is lateral and vertical, or diachronic and synchronic. One is the neighborhood and one is a potential forward paths. For those who don't know, diachronic and synchronic is used in philology classically. It's like, do you want to understand a historical text as it's influenced the future, as it went through time, as it were? Or do you want to understand in its context then, synchronic, right? In the time then. So it's like a local context versus a diachronic context, dia through time. So science tends to be forward, right? What is the next possibility? What is the thing to choose? How do we accelerate this momentum forward? But the lateral with the synchronic can maybe be the artistic, right? What is the non-pragmatic relations of interest? And what is next to this place? Right? What is around it? What gives this place meaning? Which is exactly also related to the picture of ecosystems of society. We accelerate innovation, we create new technologies, we build our society higher and higher, stacking technology upon innovation. But that's going to be unstable. Who's going to make sure that the stacking of stuff remains well organized? Why is there bureaucratic bloats? Because there's a bloat of disorder. You want both. Sorry, I have a tendency to ramble. Yeah.
Well, I intrinsically understand you. Hi.
Hi.
I was quiet until now. But I'm a bit fearful of this notion that artists should have a function, and that they could and shall play out this function in society, because then maybe
you mean what I implied
of grounding this poetic notion into our shared existence. At least that's how I got this. The implicit need for poesis and the artist as a possible person or role to do that. But even that would still be confirmed to a noetic organization in the end. No, like, it would still systematically deduce.
Oh, like an Adam Smith division of labor. No, I never argued for that. I'm just taking the archetype of the poetic. But no, my whole point is that scientists should be artists and artists should be scientists. The thing is exactly the opposite, right? I'm saying it shouldn't be like specifically attributed to one and the other. It's not an Adam Smith-like division of labor. The whole point is that we all are poetic and noetic, and we need this to be distributed, right? And I said everyone has a role in contributing to our collective sense-making. But the function is not the emphasis. The value is the emphasis. There are some clear value in poetic modes of sense-making, which all contributes, along with the other modes, to the function of being human, of letting this ecosystem of evolution actually remain human in the sense of conform the way that humanity constantly reinvents itself, rather than conforming to the increasing machination and algorithmization, the sterilization of a notion what it is to be human in terms of normative properties, right? Right, rigid ideal.
Yeah, but I was also thinking how perhaps, the different kinds of sense-making are both present, but however, they cannot be simultaneous. Because then you're mad.
No.
I do feel a bit mad, I gotta say.
I really do think that if you try to take out facts of your intuitive exploration and that doesn't match, and what you're doing, like, you enter a gray zone where you can either go mad or mad. Like it's quite there. Yeah, because if you start proposing such I don't know, such terrific ideas in like I don't know, if you come up with the I can't even like fathom now what you could think of in your exploration of yourself, of your environment, of any material, or of this hair, and I start thinking about this hair, and if I want to talk about this artificial hair that is supposed to, if I think about it artistically, I won't approach it with what is its function.
Mm-hmm.
I won't approach it as a sound buffer. I won't think of it like that. But artistically, I might think of a fox, or I might go thinking about the fairy tale I heard as a kid. Like, you don't know where it will take you.
Mm-hmm.
But so at what point and for which reason would I want to get actual facts about this object while I'm thinking about all the potential imaginary possibilities of this object? Why do I have to incorporate what actually this really?
What's your answer?
There is no
you want to?
possibilities and facts. I mean, it's a continuum. Nothing is a fact. Everything is, we know something about that hair and it makes me think of a fox and it is plastic. I mean, it's an artificial distinction between what's factual and what's potential. The whole of our cognition works with things that are to some degree probable, and that's one of the nice things about this system of Friston, which is that you abduce what the world is, and abduce means you're not certain, and you can abduce something that you're 99% certain that this hair is plastic, and you can abduce that maybe it has something vaguely to do with a fox. But there's
but this is still in the order of something that scientifically you can approach. But my imaginative thinking
I think what Francis is saying is what allows what you're saying to happen, right? The fact that you're abducing means that there's this freedom, there's a space to remake how you're abducing, to rearrange the parts somehow, so you can end up with it being a troll that lives in a forest rather than being a sound buffer, because you're able to rearrange the nodes.
Oh no.
We lost the line. The brain is constantly abducing. It means it's hypothesizing things that may have caused whatever you see, and it does it in a very flexible way. Sometimes it's very factual, sometimes it's purely imaginative and illusory, and there's a whole range in between. And the whole thing about conceptual metaphors is that we constantly use metaphors in language, and sometimes the metaphors are very poetic and indirect, and sometimes the metaphors are so clear that everybody kind of assumes that they're describing reality, but it's never.
Sorry, my internet died.
It's never purely.
Francis took over.
There's this whole continuum in between, and we are most of the time in the middle.
Right. No, but I was just thinking of another level of this imaginative thinking, is that, yeah, you are abducing all the time and you are shuffling, and sure, we can approach it from that angle. I'm not saying, I understand, I agree. But on a different level, as you go further, and if you actually incorporate two ways of thinking and you get the logic or the analytic logic and you apply it to imaginative thinking, what you will end up with is that you will probably create an entire world of hairs. And in this world, you will leave behind any kind of anchoring.
Oh, no. Why?
That's the second level of this. That's like once you start expanding on this, no?
I think
no, because the scaffolding individually leads to scaffolding synergetically, as in, look, you can't scaffold the unity without the scaffolding individually, right? If there's a second level,
and this is why I say you would go mad finally.
No, because you can't get to the second level of unity without the first level of unity. There's always been necessity, a kind of grounding and scaffolding, because without it, it is unstable. It's the other way around, right? The instability is kind of the exception. I mean, things like schizophrenia and other modes of, let's say, incoherence is indeed this kind of problem. But it's actually, I think, more about the unipolarity. Think about, let's say, I mean, God damn it, just Trump, you know, Trump and America and right-wing politics. You get these systematized, abstract, logical systems that create the illusion of a grounding. But it's not grounded in empirical reality. It's grounded in each other. It's incestuous, right? So Huxley talked about the celibacy of the intellect, right? Where you have no interpollination of different space and domains. But you can also have this incestuous intellect where they ground themselves in each other with the illusion of being a sufficient replacement for empirical reality.
Sorry,
so
that's
scientific reality.
Why is that? If this, what Trump is doing, was presented in a gallery,
yeah,
it gets like you presented as it's really bad, it's incestuous. Maybe that's exactly what an artist wants to do. Maybe that's exactly what an artist is doing, right? And so why is it bad?
No, I don't agree.
Because he's in a position where you can't fucking do that. He's not in a position where that is the goal. That is a position where you need a particular emphasis on noetic. I mean, a good example of balancing noetic and poetic as a state leader is New Zealand's, I forgot her name, New Zealand's president. She balances that. You know, she's clearly rooted in a scientific knowledge. She's noetic when she needs to, and she acknowledges, is sensitive to the emotional and affective needs of the people. She recognizes that people are these kind of...
But okay, fine. We're talking about really positions that hold some functions to society.
Yes.
And we have the benefit that art doesn't have a pre-described function to society. In that case, we don't have to follow, you know, the expectation that we put on a president of New Zealand, and we put the same expectation on an artist, right?
But there's a very big difference between saying everyone needs a function and everything needs to be assigned a function, and saying some places need a function. A very big difference, right? I'm not saying every single entity or role needs to be given a particular set of function rigidity. I'm only saying some positions do need that. That's how we evolved. That's how we constructed it. We designed society such that some places have very stringent rules on what the function should be, such that other people don't have that stringent rules, right? The responsibility to take it by one gives the freedom to another.
Wow, sorry, total distraction.
Okay. But no, I'm not claiming, I'm not suggesting we should give everyone strict, stringent rules. And to be very clear, again, the poetic noetic is not something that can be defined in properties. It's a disposition. We're now talking about it in terms of language, in terms of, you know, tendencies, associations, not as a definition, but to give you a good bootstrap, a good starting point to have your own intuitive understanding with it. So I reject all a priori intrinsic properties or definitions of the poetic and noetic. It's just a polarity within us.
I think I may better understand what both Marco and Katharina were driving on, what I would call this pathological combination of the poetic and the noetic. The pathological combination of the poetic and the noetic is that you create some kind of an imaginary world, and then you apply a logic and rationality to it as if it is the real world, and then you create a completely, as you call it, incestuous view where the rules are there because they are the rules, and the rules justify themselves, and they're all very logical and coherent, but they have nothing to do with the real world. And I think lots of people live in these kind of worlds. You have a number of, like, typically religious sects do that. They create their own world where there are very strict rules about how everything is. IS, Islamic State, had such a world with such rule. They were very logical in applying their interpretation of Islamic law, but it was a world that has nothing to do with the real world. And it's also a danger I see in lots of what I would call nerdish types, people who get so immersed into an imaginary universe like Star Wars or Star Trek, that they live as if that's the real world, and they use all the logic and they speak all the languages in Star Trek as if that's the most important thing in the world. Now, as a hobby, it's not bad. I don't mind it. You might say it's like art, but the problem is you should still be able to get out of that and see that is not the real world. That is an imaginary construction that has been put under a logic that is noetic, and because of that, given the impression that it is something important and serious, while it is just an artistic creation, you might say. It's not reality.
Yeah, I would then argue that we are all, to a certain degree, pathologically both.
Well said. That's the whole point, actually.
Okay, guys. I think we gotta call it quits.
Yes.
Thank you for this wonderful experience and opportunity. This was much more positive reception than I expected.
Mark, I will send you some papers because the things I've been working on with Katarina and others are very close to what interests you. So we'll hear more from you. Okay. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Marco.
Thank you too.
Thanks.
Bye.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao, Anna.
Bye.
Okay, I end the call, and yeah, speak to you guys hopefully soon.
Speak soon. Thank you again.
Yeah. Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.